All right, welcome. This is Jay's Analysis. I'm your host, Jay Dyer. Tonight we have I can't talk. We have a special treat. We have Church of the Eternal Logos. He started his own cult directly from the madness of Terence McKenna. No, I'm joking. He is a guy who went from the crazy world of Hermeticism and alchemy into Orthodoxy. And he's been putting out some really good content in the last few months. I have watched about 4 or 5 of his longer videos in the last couple weeks. And we've been planning to have a talk ever since the Kurgan fiasco is when I really started watching his videos. So if you remember the nonsense of the Kurgan, then you can go check out his prediction, which was accurate. He predicted what would happen in the Kurgan debate. So we kind of hit it off right off the bat, and then Sneck said, why don't we all get together and do a chat? And so we're going to do that. So our old buddy Sneck, Ortho Bro Sneck, and Church of the Eternal Logos join me. How you guys doing?
Great. Thanks for having me on, Jay. I really appreciate it. I've been a fan of yours for a while now, especially after I got into Orthodox theology, and I watched your Logos Logoi video. That was the first video I saw of yours, and then that took me to Numbers Prove God, and then that took me to your website, reading your article, and basically been following your stuff ever since then.
Awesome. Yeah, that was an old one. I remember some of the Thomists were mad that they said that I never ever talked about the fact that John Damascus utilizes a lot of the Aristotelian terms and categories, which is ridiculous because back in 2015, I had done that talk on the Logos and the Logi from the philosophical chapters of St. John Damascus. So if you haven't watched that video, guys out there, that's a good one. It's just an introduction to some of the philosophical concepts that St. John Damascus uses in the philosophical chapters. So you can go find that video. It's called Hidden Metaphysics, Part 1. So go listen to that. But Sneck joins us. Sneck, last time we were talking about the papacy and those kinds of issues. And then Taylor Marshall, we did a lengthy response to Taylor Marshall. We had a pretty good viewership on that. But let's get to Church of the Eternal Logos. Tell us briefly, I mean, it doesn't have to be super brief, but as long as you're willing to tell us, about your journey from, well, you have a really fascinating story. It actually reminds me of Michael Witkoff, who came on a couple years ago. I did an interview with. He was very interested in Hermeticism and kind of the esoteric stuff before he got into Orthodoxy. So tell us your journey.
So it really started about my undergraduate. I was interested in East Asian traditions. I kind of grew up Methodist, and I took a Bible class at my undergraduate school. It's called IUPUI, Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. And it was there I took this Bible class, and then, of course, it introduces you to much more critical scholarship and really, overturned the apple cart in terms of what I thought was true. And then that kind of sent me into the nihilistic atheism, where I studied science and did biology, then got enamored with East Asian traditions and kind of studied martial arts and stuff like that. So I was really interested in Taoism particularly. And at the time, I was interested in martial arts. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to go to China. So I studied Mandarin for 3 years, but 2 summers in southern China. Got there, realized I do not like Chinese culture, and the Chinese have nothing to do with Taoism or the kind of idealized, Oriental understanding Westerners have of China. Taoist monks doing Tai Chi up on the mountain, why the mist is moving past. Nothing like that at all. They're capitalistic. They're materialistic. It's all about money. So I realized definitely don't want to spend any more time focusing on Chinese scholarship. So I did my master's degree over at the University of Illinois on early Christianity and psychedelic shamanism. So there was a professor there that focused on Native American studies, and I really delved into psychedelic shamanism. And there was a scholar there who was writing on Gnosticism and various texts. So I was studying Koine Greek with him and really was interested in Gnosticism basically. And at this time, I'm a non-believer. I'm big into psychedelics. I had started a YouTube channel called Fractal Universe Productions. It got about 73,000 subs, but I don't produce content on there anymore, basically because of my journey. But at the time, I'm at my master's degree.
Did
doing
you
all
ever
this stuff.
talk to the mushroom?
Did
you talk to the mushroom in the fractal universe?
I actually never had like an encounter with the beings. I did the DMT. I've gone to ayahuasca ceremonies. I've done LSD, MDMA,
really?
Psilocybin. I always had positive experiences, but it was never the kind of interdimensional, robotic, elf-like creatures that McKenna's always talking about. But I was really enamored with that culture. That culture seemed like the kind of epitome of where knowledge about religion was, right? I kind of fancied myself as a religious studies scholar. And, well, this is kind of where the leading edge is. And then I decided, of course, I wanted to go on from there and get my doctorate. But I thought, I was still infatuated with the McKenna, Robert Anton Wilson's, the Learys, Western esotericism, all this stuff. And I went to Berkeley. I got accepted to the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. And it was when I went there, again, the worldview I had totally flipped upside down because I saw where all these conclusions lead. I saw the school. I saw the relativism. I saw the openness with drug culture and promiscuity in regards to sexuality and all this stuff. And my politics were changing. Not that I'm a big fan of Donald Trump or anything, but I realized I'm just much more traditional in my politics. And then I started, the first semester I did research on a book called The Psychedelic Gospels. This is written by Jerry and Julie Brown, where they highlight all these frescoes in Europe that have what looks to be mushrooms, red and white Amanita muscaria mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms. And the thesis of his book is that there was a secret tradition within Christianity that was perpetuated from its inception of basically having a psychedelic Eucharist. Of course, after I did a semester studying that certainly wasn't the case. All these frescoes were contextualized between basically the 900s to the 1300s. And it's reminiscent, from my understanding, of the Cathars, of the sort of Manichaean Gnostic, infusion into Christianity. That's why they're all occurring at a particular time frame. And I thought, oh, well, this is fascinating. Maybe it's in Eastern Orthodox, because at the time my girlfriend was Eastern Orthodox, but I didn't know anything. I'm a non-believer, right? So I take a class at the Graduate Theological Union with the Greek Orthodox there. And of course, I'm thinking maybe I'm going to go through their art and maybe I'll find some references to mushrooms. Of course, that's not what happened, but I got deep into the theology because there is no Orthodox history without learning the theology. So I'm reading Lasky and Staniloy and Florowski and everybody, and it started. The idea of logos really started to penetrate my mind. Is like, man, and it really started to challenge my preconceptions about dialectics and stuff like this. And that's when, about that summer, after that semester of reading Orthodox theology, I really got enamored with the idea of logos and how this was really a more superior spiritual, religious, philosophical, theological worldview than anything that I had put together. That mine was really falling apart in the presence of logos theology from the Eastern Orthodox understanding. And that's when I started to watch your video. That's when I looked up the logos logo thing, because I was getting into my first, spiritual purpose. When I was reading the theology, I wasn't really Eastern Orthodox, but I'm becoming more enamored. So I bought the On the Cosmic Mystery of Jesus Christ by Maximus the Confessor. And I read that, and I'm trying to scratch in my head, and that's when I watched your video on logos logoi, and things really started to take off from there. And ever since then, I've just had an insatiable appetite for Orthodox theology and reading it and learning about it, and really for the last year, then attending the Divine Liturgy. And so now I'm a catechumen in the Antiochian North American Church here in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's St. Mary of Egypt. I just love it. I love it. It's so funny how people try to talk, they don't understand the whole idea. And so when I talk to people who know who I was, who know, that was part of the other YouTube channel, and that was the main way I was making money, and I don't post any of those videos. I don't really make money from that channel anymore because it just goes against to what I believe to be true. But they don't understand this whole thing about becoming Christian. How can Christian? They think it's an easy way out, but there's nothing easy about being Orthodox. It's so much more difficult in terms of, really looking at yourself, critiquing your own sins, the comfortability you find within your own sinful nature, and then challenging that and changing your behavior. So since then, once I started to attend those divine liturgies, that's when I first started my YouTube channel, Church of the Eternal Logos. And I've made a lot of mistakes in regards to talking about Orthodox theology. So anybody out there who, has been Orthodox much longer than I have, I apologize if you watch my videos and, I misphrase something or say something wrong. I'm still learning, but I feel an immense passion in defending the tradition and trying to get young people to see how spiritual ideas like panpsychism, it falls apart in the front of like logos theology or something like this. But that same urge of a divine mind is there. And so that kind of brings us to the present moment then. And that is my testimony. That is my journey to Orthodoxy.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, it bears similarities to Father Seraphim Rose, the interest in, the Far Eastern Chinese philosophy, and then, moving through these stages towards Orthodoxy. So have you heard that? Did you know about his interest in those things?
Yeah, I've read, I got Seraphim Rose's Nihilism and the Orthodoxy Religion of the Future. I've read both those books. Okay. I love Orthodoxy Religion of the Future and the kind of anti-rationalism, anti-logical approach of the Eastern traditions, because that's really what it is. Yeah. And it's that same method in which we defend Orthodoxy. And that's, once you see that, it's hard to go back.
Awesome. Yeah. And by the way, everybody, we will be taking super chats. We got one. We'll read those later on. Thank you for that, Robert. Anybody who wants to ask us questions, we're going to be getting into some of the more heavy topics here in a little bit. But Sneck, tell us about you. Like, I know that in the past, maybe when we did our show on the Jesuits a few months ago, people might have heard it, but they might not be familiar, or we've got new people since then. So tell us a little bit about your conversion, your path to Orthodoxy, and then we'll move into the topics for tonight.
Oh, yeah, so actually, I met Church of the Eternal Logos by chatting with him on over Twitter, and I realized that we had a similar story. So I was born in France, born in a culturally Catholic family, but in a really atheistic world. Went to Catholic school, Catholic high school. The bishop was a headmaster, and so I learned about all this, but I fell into really deep atheism. Then I look into some political ideology, which to an extent are religion, liberalism, and so on. And I met people, which is very common in the at least French business world, who are Guénonians. So Sophia Perennialist.
René Guénon.
Yeah. And I got into this world of trying to mix and match religion and trying to look at the tradition like an archaeologist picking whatever you like, and trying to find the directing line. It's basically religious evolutionism when you think about it. And I got into the Guénonian idea and the idea of Sufi mysticism. And what I realized when going a bit further is that this all actually stems from Orthodoxy, hesychasm. That was as they took it from, and that Christianity was heavily distinguished from the rest. So then I went into looking into Christianity, so back into the Protestant world, trad world, and when you're in France, you got, especially over the internet, a lot of trad world, and I tried to look at it. I was confused because everybody was throwing theological truth at me. So I look at it through the historical lenses, and I was like, oh, okay, so let's look at the schism. Let's look at what happened with the Orientals. And every time Orthodox seemed reinforced. So I went into Orthodoxy in one way through mysticism, in another way through the historical side, which is, the great thing that our church is mystical, but it is also visible. And I started to understand it better. I left my baggage of mysticism and Sufism, just threw that away, and I went deeper into it and I studied it. And I lived in Germany at the time. I began going to church, started catechumenate, came back to France, and there we started a Discord server. We started a website with the help of a deacon from the Moscow Patriarchate. We had many clergy and so on coming in, and to this day it's still running. We're converting people, we're making debates, and it's going fine. I'm probably going to Russia soon to finalize the baptism, because in France it's really difficult to get baptized.
The Novus Ordo bishops just did their whole thing with making gender. The Novus Ordo, quote, Catholic bishops did the thing where you don't have gender on a birth certificate, right?
Yeah, that's in France. But in France, in the Orthodox Church, sometimes you will have some problems because the Catholic Church managed to be still a bit institutionalized. So when they will do rebaptisms, they will go out after people and start creating a lot of drama here. Okay. So people usually go to the monasteries and things like this. Yeah.
By the way, and for people that aren't aware, we're going to be mentioning a little bit about St. Gregory Palamas. There's no problem with reason. Reason is a faculty that we have that is useful in a certain way. It's useful in a certain degree, right? So we don't exalt reason to the point of godhood. We also don't deny reason, but reason can only take us so far. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. But for those who think that what we talk about is yoga and Sufism and all that, actually there's a good book by John Meyendorff on this issue, St. Gregory Palamas and Orthodox spirituality. He'll actually contrast our view with yoga, with all that kind of stuff. So we're not yoga proponents, we're not Sufis. These are kind of the low IQ level attacks that people banter about on the internet in terms of our views. But one last question for you, and then Church of the Eternal Logos, I want you to comment on this too. But Sneck, we were talking in Discord the other day, and I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but you had a really good way of putting it in terms of like the main problem with perennialism. I think you summed it up somehow. The way you realized what you were doing was just like this piecemeal buffet style metaphysical project, and it kind of eventually occurred to you that that what you're looking for isn't a metaphysical project or something like that.
Yeah, it's an Eastern buffet. So all the Orientalists, they will go and try to piece things together. And so actually what they will usually do is to look at any sort of similarities and strip everything that differentiates religions, and then try to make this sort of tree. And the idea is that it starts with pure divinity and then it degrades. So you have categories that are conflicting. For example, Guénon talks about Islam being most preserved, but at the same time will take all of its inspiration through Hinduism because it's the oldest one. So they will have self-conflicting things. So it will be about mashing up all these things, not really regarding the reality of it, and saying that everything that differentiates a religion is it's just exoteric. It's a form of ecumenism, and then it's trying to pace a sort of grand narrative and religious evolutionism. That's how I usually put it. To try to piece out some bones and try to say, you see, it evolved and it went to this branch or this branch. And the strength of Orthodoxy is that it rejects this because it is strong. It has personal theology, so it cannot go into the generic theism problem, and that's why at least these people couldn't really infiltrate Orthodoxy. So you see, Guénon had no problem going to the Freemasonry, going into Roman Catholic Church, he's then going to Sufism. But when they try to do it with Orthodoxy, and we have a real mystical tradition. We've got hesychasm. It's unequaled. I've looked everywhere. It's the only place where it is like this. And for example, Valsin, who was an occultist, tried to go to Mount Athos.
Slow down. Who?
Valsin was an occultist and a pawn of Guénon. Guénon, and he tried to go into Mount Athos and try to stitch Orthodoxy into this Frankenstein religion that they were creating, and the monks just kicked him out. No, we don't have secrets to give you. We don't have anything to give you.
Right.
We don't understand you. You're a Romanian guy who converted to Sufism. Get out.
Now I bring that up because we actually have quite a few people who bring up perennialism, the Sophia Perennis, all the time. Traditionalism, this comes up a lot. I get a lot of questions. Well, why aren't you a traditionalist? Why are you a perennialist? I had a phase of in my late 20s being very interested in these schools, René Guénon and Evola, and I know people debate who is and who isn't a traditionalist. I don't care, right? I've read Fritjof Schuon, I've read his debate with Girard, I've read a lot of these guys. I have Charles Upton's books, I have a whole shelf of perennialist traditional stuff. So I'm familiar with these guys, these writers, these ideas, and how at times it overlaps with Sufism, how at times it overlaps with Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, Kabbalism. That was all stuff I studied and read in my 20s, right? So, and I think all of us can recognize having a progression in our thought. Many of us have had changes of mind from the time that we were in our 20s. It's not that big of a deal. And I think, like you said, Church of Eternal Logos, I got to find a better, quicker name for you. Kotel.
Patrick works.
Kotel.
I just go by Patrick.
How about I call you Kotel?
Because I put Cotel, and people were like, who is Kotel? Why you having Kotel? All right, Patrick. So you said something about, realizing that we can be wrong. That's normal. It's okay. It's not, and it happens to me. I've studied this stuff for a long time. Fairly recently, maybe 2 years ago, I was actually pretty wrong about something that related to the nature of Christ in terms of whether his humanity was fallen or not. So once I saw what John Damascus, St. Maximus said on that matter, I was able to correct my opinion because I was wrong. So that's the right attitude, right? We're not, being a heretic is not something that you get this a lot in Western Christianity, and especially in terms of Calvinism or traditional Roman Catholicism. It's like a state of being, that your very being is heretical. It's a privation, it's a lack, right? That's not what, we don't think nature itself is evil. And you kind of get that attitude in a lot of people who get very, sort of spurgy about dogma and doctrine, is that it's not the error itself that makes you a heretic. It's the obstinacy and the willfulness and the pride that makes a person a heretic. So everybody, we've all got things that we're wrong about, and I'm just making the point that we should have the attitude that it's okay to be corrected at any point. And I notice this with a lot of people. You can see where they're wrong, you can pinpoint where they're wrong, but whether they're willing to be, or to recognize where they're wrong is a whole other issue. But did you have an interest, Patrick, in traditionalism, quote unquote, perennialism, Sophia Perennis, and was that a phase, or were you more interested in like the Hermetic, alchemy, that kind of stuff?
I'd probably say more the Hermetica, the Prisca Theologica, stuff like that. And for me, the way that I kind of see it is a presupposition of capitalism, of consumerism. And that's why you see a lot of the perennialism coming out of the Western world, is because it is a hodgepodge of consuming world religions, consuming tradition. Then you're kind of extracting it out of its natural context. And so the whole project is relativism, because the epistemology of Hinduism or Hermeticism or Neoplatonism or Orthodox Christianity or Catholic, it's all different. And so it's just it's an irrational kind of that's why Westerners, I think, are so susceptible to perennialism, so susceptible to New Age religion, is because they already are embedded in a worldview of consumerism.
Yes, where you can basically, everything is commodified and you can just go shop for it, basically.
Yeah,
right.
And that's what you will encounter, especially in the business circles. In the business circles, you will always have this guy who will have, this idea of the Übermensch, but also, being very trad and justifying his behavior by thinking he belongs to a specific Hindu class. Yeah, it's very prevalent in business circles. So we already have these ideas and presuppositions.
Right. All right, so let's get into the subject matter that we want to cover tonight. I think, Sneck, you had a brief outline that you wanted us to get into. So we're going to talk about, I think, what was it, Apophaticism first, and that we're going to let, who do we say? Is Patrick going to lead off on that topic?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, so in three parts, Apophatism and Ecclesiology will go and start with this.
Oh, you're going to start.
So,
okay. So tell us about, so for those that don't know, Apophatism is the theology of negation, the via negativa. This is approaching things that are not able to be defined in terms of positive categories. So if you think of something like infinity, if you think about numbers, if you think about something like omniscience, right? We don't know what it is directly to be infinite. We don't have an experiential knowledge of infinity, so we explain it by what it's not, right? It's not finitude, it's beyond finitude, etc. And so a lot of the Orthodox theology, when we speak of who God is, in terms of his essence, we don't know that. We don't know the inner being of God. We only know God as he's revealed to us, and that's kind of the essence synergy distinction. So go ahead and tell us about apophatic theology, but not so much theology proper. You wanted to talk about apophaticism in terms of ecclesiology, which is really interesting because we don't typically think of ecclesiology as the domain where that would be applicable, but it is. Tell us about that.
Yes, that's very interesting. So first of all, it's to deflect a very low IQ comment that some people have about this when we start to say that we define ourselves contrary to heresies, for example. So say, you're a theology of negation, your church exists to not be as the others, which first of all is wrong. We define ourselves in positive ways, but we can also define ourselves in negative ways. And it starts at the very beginning in discipline. If we go at the very, very beginning of the church, and even in the Bible, Christ sees how the Pharisees pray, and he literally tells us, don't pray like them. Don't make a show of it. This also is the parable of the Pharisee and the Pharisee and the publican. The Jesus prayer that we do, this humble prayer. It comes from this. It comes from this idea that we have a right to define ourselves positively, but we also have a right to define ourselves negatively. And it continues early on, very early in church tradition. You can see it in the Didache. So in the Didache, there is, we are saying, the Jews are fasting on these days, do not do like them. This is not the church defining itself in mean ways or anything. It is the church understanding that there are parts that needs to be removed. That Christ himself said, some parts will go away. I came to bring the sword. And actually, if we look at how the church is fundamentally organized, it is organized in councils. So these councils are called to answer a heresy. So, for example, before iconoclasm, there were icons in churches and there were no icons in churches. Some churches didn't have icons, iconostasis. They had proskyneirion, but not a full iconostasis. And the heresy was starting to smash them. So we defined ourselves in not being iconoclast, and we said, no, you have to kiss them. Mm-hmm. So every council is predicated on these ideas, on the idea of seeing this, and this heresy is the new enemy of the church, and we need to remove it, and we need to precise the apostolic doctrine in regards to these problems that arose. We can see it in what the council give. The council produced 3 types of documents: the Declaration of Faith, which is the positive, infallible declaration of what we believe. It produces canons, which is the normative discipline to be held, and it produces anathemas. Anathemas as a way the church has to define its theology negatively. We do not believe in this. Mm-hmm. We do not believe in this and that. Even the Declaration of Faith oftentimes is negative. If you look at Chalcedon, since God is so great and since the epistatic union is beyond our imagination, Chalcedon only can define the epistatic union precisely in what it is not, without confusion, without change, the 4 withouts of Chalcedon. And we can see it, of course, in the church comparing itself. And Trullo is a great counsel for this. Right. It's again about discipline, but the canons themselves can be defined negatively as well. So, for example, we soon will do the cheese fair week. There's a week where we don't eat meat before Lent. Actually, it was a reaction. If you look at the canons of, I think it's Trullo. Trullo says, you cannot do this because the Armenians are doing this. So in return, you will eat cheese because they're abstaining from cheese, and this is not the right way. So the church always precised itself in contrast to heresies. So as much as the church defines itself positively, it can define itself negatively, and we can see it inside the organization of the church itself. Not only in our theology, and ultimately it comes down to humility. That the fact that God is so much greater that we cannot positively talk about God. We can talk about what He is not, and that's where we enter the more theological part.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so there is a apophatic dimension even to ecclesiology and the way that we respond to errors in the history of the church. And pretty much every council that met in the first millennium was meeting to address a specific heresy that was spreading throughout the church. So we're not here to produce the infallible papal list of decrees that you have to know and believe to be saved, because that doesn't actually work. The history of the church is rather responding to there's a deposit of faith that comes from the apostles and their tradition, their teaching, that's given to the churches, and then the councils meet in response to the errors, right? So that, as Sneck is pointing out, is more of an apophatic approach than some sort of way to have the infallible list of all the infallible teachings of the infallible guys, because that doesn't actually work. But by the way, I want to add people in the chat. So I'm getting multiple messages from people, a lot of people who are big supporters and send super chats keep getting banned. So maybe lighten up a little bit on dropping the ban hammer, because a lot of these people are supporters. And so if somebody says but or ass, don't ban them for cuss words. I don't care about cuss words. If they say stuff that's, violent or crazy, yes, please ban them. But not for innocuous stuff like that. That's not that big of a deal. So anyway, I'm not mad at anybody. It's just I keep getting messages of people getting banned too easily and too quickly. So Church of the Eternal Logos. What's your thought on Apophaticism? I know you wanted to let's see. Maybe I should follow your list here, Sneck. What was your next your next point here. Apophatism and discipline. Holistic comparisons. Did you want to talk about holistic comparisons to other, an apophatic worldview and holistic comparisons?
Yeah. So that's also very interesting, and this is from Larcher actually. By
the way, hold on. You talk really fast, and a lot of the English people have a hard time understanding the words. So he's talking about Jean-Claude Larcher, who's a really prominent French Orthodox theologian. I have Larcher's set on here, Theological Therapy of Spiritual Illness, which is in English, but some of his other stuff's not in English. But he's a really, really great theologian. He has a new book out on media, critiquing mass media. So Larcher is definitely somebody that we should recommend. Go ahead.
Yeah, so in his great book, Jean-Claude Larcher, called L'Église corps de Christ, so the Church Body of Christ, what Larcher also talks about is the theandric nature of the Church might outwardly make it look like it has some contradiction, as every single system. However, and we're going to talk about this, with Palamas and so on, and God being above contradictions. But in our search for truth and in determining the true church, we have to take this apophatic approach and looking like what the church cannot be, what the church is on a holistic level. And that's why Jay is doing great work comparing worldviews. So you're not only comparing one specific point, because the basis is already theory laden. The basis of any discussion on a single point, it's already giving or conceding to one side or the other. So in our search for the truth, in determining the truth, we also have to look at the church negatively. And we can do this. We can look at not what church fits some criterion, but what criterion it doesn't fit, and what is not the one and only worldview, but what is the most coherent. So we also have to work like this by removing all the different churches, all the different worldviews, and we can look at this from the perspective that the Church of the Eternal Logos and I went through. We start from a basis and then we remove things. So that's also very interesting. His book on the church and determining the church and finding the church is great, and I wish it was in English.
Oh, the Larcher book's not in English on the church? Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it is. He has really, really great books that are sadly not in English. He's got the books tracing the history of essence energy distinctions from the early fathers to St. John of Damascus, which again is the essence energy is the threads that go through along the entirety of church history. We're going to discuss this. It's the only theology that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. If you do want something from Larcher in English, you don't want to get that whole 3-volume set, which is really good. It's basically from the Church Fathers and the Saints on responding to all the vices with virtue is what the therapy of spiritual illness is. Larcher also has this book on the media, which if you follow Jay's analysis, you'll find a lot of similarities between what he talks about in here and the epidemic of the media, which is his newest book, which is good. But yeah, so Patrick, let's get your take on some of that. What do you think about? Have you ever thought about Apophaticism in relationship to the church, and does that relate to your journey in terms of perhaps looking at other churches? Like, what about Protestantism or Roman Catholicism stuck out to you that you didn't ultimately choose Rome or the world of Protestantism?
Well, for me, it's actually had nothing to do with ecclesiology. My transition was very intellectual, was very interested in more philosophical, theological in terms of these dialectics. This is what I didn't realize this was a problem until I realized it was a problem. And then this is what really set me on my way. And so in regards to Apophaticism, what I wanted to mention today was sort of transcending the dialectic between cataphatic and apophatic theology, because even though Apophaticism is so associated with Orthodoxy and mysticism, and then Orthodoxy being the sort of mystical church, this is very common within Neoplatonism. And so the way, when we think of somebody like Pseudo-Dionysius, although you sent me an article today, maybe I shouldn't call him pseudo anymore, Dionysius, but he's kind of associated with the sort of apophatic theological approach.
Yeah.
And then he's always critiqued for being so Neoplatonic. He's often critiqued for being a monophysite, for his emphasis on the transcendency of God. Of course, he uses Plotinus' sort of sculptor analogy in terms of apophatic theology being a sort of negation, a sort of taking away from the marble to get to the sculpture underneath. And then he has a lot of sections that are very similar to Proclus, but the way that Orthodoxy does it, and I think it's most explicit in Maximus the Confessor, is even the collapsing of the dialectic between cataphatic and apophatic, which I think distinguishes Orthodoxy from Neoplatonism, a tradition that's doing just that. So if some of you guys are familiar, I know I became aware of it from Jay, but the book God, History, and Dialectics, this was probably, out of all the things I read, the most essential and most important book that I read in regards to Orthodoxy, in terms of now having the kind of conceptual categories to then see all this stuff and see how it's all about the collapsing of dialectics. And this is, for me, why Orthodoxy, why Logos theology is the truth, because we don't get caught up in these things. And so for Maximus, he has a really interesting approach to God, and this is in regards to the Ambiguum 34, and I think this is also reiterated in his Mystagogia. But his approach towards God is a kind of threefold process. And again, it's trying to collapse the dialectic between apophatic theology and cataphatic theology, and then show how we actually have an out, where the Neoplatonists, somebody who, we would say the Catholics, absolute divine simplicity, somebody who posits a sort of simple essence of God, really doesn't have an out. Of course, the Catholics can revert to revelation, which is our out. But his kind of tripartite process begins with God is the cause of all that is known and predicated, and thus can be called the mind, the word, the logos, the life of everything. So that's sort of a cataphatic approach. This is step one. Mm-hmm. Step two is, as the source of all being, God cannot be put into some category or the same category as beings. He transcends them, and thus should be more properly called non-being. Well, then you hear that, you think, well, being, non-being, Maximus, you sound a bit dialectic there. But then on the third part, he says, therefore the theologian has to realize that ultimately the predications of being and non-being are not predicated of God in a proper sense, right, as neither presents God as he is in his essence. Yep. Therefore, God is beyond cataphatic or apophatic descriptions. Correct. And what we're left with then is revelation. And so the reason I brought up the God, History, and Dialectic book is because the Ordo Theologiae, the proper beginning point, is always personhood. And even the hypostasis is a sort of collapsing of dialectics in terms of divine nature, human nature, collapsing into personhood. And so I think this is huge. And so unlike the Neoplatonists who, because both the Christian and the Neoplatonists, we're both doing apophatic theology, but we still have to account for how does a transcendent God who transcends all categories, who transcends all language, relate to creation. And so the Neoplatonists, all they have is emanationism. They have this kind of concentric circles from the center perfect one, where we have the incarnation. And so this is really big, that Christian theology can actually affirm God's epistemological and ontological transcendence due to God's incarnation, and that being the most imminent, the imminence of God in creation, as he both reveals himself so we can find him, yet remains ontologically transcendent. And so this is a really, this may be too abstract, but to me this is like a really, really big point, that there's three moves here. There's, God's totally transcendent, and then the transcendency of God becomes immanent, and the immanent the immanency of God reveals his transcendency. Again,
Right.
another threefold process, another collapsing of dialectics. Sorry, go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, this is, you're right. It's directly from the divine names. When I read the divine names and did a talk on it a few years ago, or maybe a year ago, I was immediately struck with how it's obviously Orthodox theology. I don't understand how anyone could or would derive Thomism from this text, because from the outset, and by the way, contrary to a lot of the assumptions that this is all based in philosophy, if you note the number of times he cites Scripture, it's pretty constant. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of biblical citations in the divine names, as I noted in my talk. And he begins with the essence-energy distinction. He begins with the divine rays that come from the One. He speaks of the unknowable essence of God and the knowable energies or rays that come down to us, the very thing Basil says in letter 234. But what I want to say and stress that's in line with what you just said is that he constantly says that God is being, God is beyond being, and he even transcends being beyond being, right? So apateron, which is to be beyond being, all of those things are true of God, right? God is one, God is many, and he also transcends one and many. God is love, and God is beyond love, right? God is unity, he's simplicity, but he also transcends unity and simplicity because, as he and the rest of the Orthodox fathers teach, any of the terms and names that we use of God are only applicable to energies. Even the name unity or one is an energy that's revealed to us. Now, it is signifying the essence of God. It is signifying that there's one essence of God. But even the name one or existence, this is somebody recently got tripped up on this and thought I was saying that God doesn't have eternal existence, which is ridiculous. But because I said that the existence of God is also an energy as it's revealed to us, they were confused. But I'm only repeating what Dionysius says, that God is existence, God is also beyond existence, you see. And so what is existence? It's a divine name that comes down to us by analogy, and therefore it's an energy. And as we'll see, St. Maximus is very clear about that. He teaches that all of the names that we use by analogia refer to the energies. And this is the key point that we have to point out against Thomism. And the reason that Dionysius does not work with Thomism is because there's two conflicting systems at work in Thomism. One of those systems wants to have via negativa. Aquinas teaches that we use the negative way, the via negativa, the way that we speak of God through negation. Then it turns around and it says, because of his presuppositions of absolute divine simplicity, that any names that we use of God are in a similitude way, in an analogical way, predicated of the divine essence because of simplicity. That's not consistent. Those two things don't work. You can't have an absolutely simple essence in a Plotinian sense, in a Hellenic sense, and then turn around and say that all of these divine names are apophatic, but also applicable to that absolutely simple essence in an analogical sense, because there's nothing analogically like an absolutely simple essence. That essence of God is not like creatures. So what is like creatures? How do we know God? The divine rays, the energies that come down to us. And he even uses the term energies. I'm speaking of Dionysius here. Dionysius says the divine rays, the divine energies, they come down to us. He says these names that we all use of God in section 8. He says all of these names that we use are dynamic energies. They are not the essence of God. And so once again, as you pointed out, this triadic movement, it's not triadic in the sense of Trinity per se, but it's just you could say a threefold movement. He uses a similar analogy of threefold movement in the 100 chapters when he applies Aristotle's terminology. It's God is revealed to us, but he also transcends what he reveals to us, right? God is immanent, but he's also transcendent. There's one energy of God, but there's also multiple energies of God, you see. So there's no fixed point at which you equate God to a conceptual definition. That's the key here. So we're not saying that the concepts in our mind bear no connection to God. They have to, or we don't know God. But we're not saying the conceptions that we have in our mind bear only a resemblance to his essence. They don't. The only thing that we know of God is what's revealed to us hypostatically, as you said, which are energies. And so the energies are inhypostatic, as St. Gregory Palamas says, which means, as you said, that they're also personal. There's no impersonal energy that, like, God, beams his essence to us or something like that, or as if the energies of God are some lesser deity that God, like, gives us some participation in. They're all personal because they all come to us from the Father through the Son and the Spirit, as St. Basil says. So every logi is an uncreated energy. Every attribute is an uncreated energy. And they come to us in that triadic way into creation. But yeah.
Go ahead.
Jay,
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off,
go ahead.
but I just wanted to point out, you could continue, is the tripartite anthropology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, St. Gregory
related
Palamas
to understanding all that.
Yeah, St. Gregory Palamas says that you can make the analogy to humanity being made in the image of the Trinity in that way. Of course, we don't liken ourselves to the essence of God in any sense, but there is St. Gregory Nyssa, St. Basil, St. Gregory Nazianzus, St. John of Damascus. They all use the mind, word, and breath analogy to the Trinity, which is a valid human analogy, you could say. And they also, St. Gregory Palamas uses a version of economic filioque as an analogy, as a psychological analogy as well. And that's ironic, though, because, to be very precise here, Roman Catholics will utilize that quote out of context and say that it proves that St. Gregory Palamas taught the filioque when it's within the section where he's refuting the filioque. It only applies to the level of energetic manifestation. Anyway, we're not going to get into all the energetic manifestation. That's a little too deep for people right now. But I just want to stress that in the divine names, the Father is the sole cause. So when we begin our Trinitarian theology with personhood, we're not speaking of personhood in some generic way. We're speaking of the personhood of the Father is the beginning point of all of our theology, all of our Trinitarian theology, all of redemption, all of history. All of it begins with the person of the Father, the unoriginate and sole cause of the Godhead, as all the fathers say, the Orthodox fathers. And we base our theology on revelation, revealed theology. Hypostatic properties are what he uses in section 4 and 5 of the Divine Names to talk about chapter 2, section 4 and 5, after he talks about the energies. It's hypostatic properties. We don't use the dialectics of opposition, Western dialectics, right? They put dialectics into the Trinity, which is ridiculous. Dialectics deals with a dyad. There's no such thing as dialectics in a triad. It's ridiculous. But because they didn't understand hypostatic properties as the way to distinguish the persons based on the Father as the sole cause, they got confused and couldn't figure out how to distinguish persons. And so they invented these ideas of notional distinctions and relations of opposition, all this speculative nonsense that goes against what was already defined as the ways to distinguish the persons.
Yeah, and those ways that you pointed out, it's the mystic system, because this just shows, this idea of dialectics, that ultimately ADS, any views that is predicated on absolute divine simplicities, rejection of distinction, which are,
yes,
essential. If you read Saint John of Damascus, is like we can't understand anything of God without distinction between the hypostases. But any system that is predicated on ADS ultimately has a huge dialectical tension between the only two way out. One of them is panentheism, is saying that everything, God's action is purely the essence, the entire world becomes the essence, everything is God's essence. This is universalism, this is linked to originism. Mm-hmm. And the other one is to say that God is very high in the sky, so much so that he cannot even interact with us.
Yeah, either everything is a manifestation of an eternal reflection in the God and the divine essence, and so it's therefore necessary and therefore eternal, and basically the same as God, a reflection of God, or as St. Gregory Palamas says to Akindinos, all of the operations of God, supposedly, that you know within history and time and space are created effects, and so you never know God himself. You only know these created causations. And a bunch of created causes can never tell you what's behind those created causes.
Yeah, and that's what you see, for example, in mainline branches of Islam, that will say that God cannot even interact with us. Thomism will at some point say that even the grace is created and everything is a hologram. And at the same time, at points in Summa, you see Aquinas saying that everything is the essence, or you will have the Sufi saying that panentheism, everything is God, every action, even bad action, are God, and the only categories that can transcend this dialectics, there's heresies on both ends. The only categories that can transcend this is the energies, is this link. This is the only way that we can have a world with an infinite absolute God and us being creatures and still being able to communicate. And that's the whole point of Christianity. God became man. So if you don't have this link, everything collapses. It's any other understanding is absolutely non-compatible with Christianity and leads to huge heresies.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We need the energies.
I just wanted to mention, too, that in the Divine Names, chapter 2 is all about Dionysius, trying to talk about how unity and differentiation within the Godhead are not in opposition. They're not in dialectical tension.
Amen. Exactly. Yeah, there's an equal ultimacy between the one and the many. Why is that so hard for people to figure out, right? If you're a Thomist, if you're a Roman Catholic, that's true. That means that God is not more one than he is three. Right, but in Thomism, and I would argue in Roman Catholic dogma, eventually it becomes normative that the simplicity of God takes preeminence and is absolute, and you have a subordination of the multiplicity and the reality of the multiplicity. But if God is an absolutely simple essence in which all the attributes are identical to his essence and the distinctions are notional, nominal, virtual, or conceptual, then how does the Son become incarnate? How does one hypostasis in that absolutely simple essence enter into time and space, enter into a mode of being that the other two hypostases don't, right? You'd have to have the whole Trinity become incarnate. And you see this problem when Augustine is even trying to solve this issue, and he says, I can't figure out how a theophany could happen because God is an absolutely simple essence. It must be the whole Trinity that becomes incarnate or present, I should say, in the pre-incarnate theophanies. So he says they're just angels. No. That's why we don't believe that they're angels. That's why we believe that the light of Tabor is uncreated, because we recognize the reality of God being able to enter into time and space. This is the consistent problem that we see in all the debates with the Muslims in my Discord, is that their Apophaticism is radical to the extent that God cannot accurately and consistently and coherently interact with or convey information or knowledge or truth about himself in history and in time and space, because he's not like anything created. So they're more consistent in their Apophaticism than the claim of Roman Catholicism that God is an absolutely simple essence, just like the many of the Muslims teach. But when we talk about him interacting in time and space at any point or in any way, it becomes totally incoherent and impossible, right? Because of their Tawhid doctrine. So, yes, thank you for pointing that out, that right away the movement of St. Dionysius in this work is to go from Apophaticism to talking about how God reveals himself in a personal way through the rays and energies that come down to us. And if you read St. Basil in Letter 234, he says to say that all these rays and operations and energies are identical is stupid. He says it's stupid. You get mad at me, so, oh, you mean the Roman Catholics. I'm just repeating what St. Basil says. He says the doctrine is stupid. So you have a problem with St. Basil, go take it up with him. The energies, the rays, he says, is all from Scripture. And then he likens it to liturgy. And then he likens it to a cosmic liturgy. So the whole cosmos is an iconographic liturgical display of the Logi, according to both Dionysius and St. Maximus, right? St. Maximus in Ambiguum 33 and 34 talks about the way that God displays himself to us via analogy. But the analogy is not to his essence. The analogy is to the energies. Maximus is very clear in both of those Ambiguum that that's true.
In those energies, Jay, I would say Proclus, the Neoplatonist, would be much similar to what you're talking about with Islam and their apophatic approach, where because they don't have the logoi, because they don't have a nous, they don't have an anthropology that actually allows a sort of understanding of God, even though it's not the essence. Doesn't mean we can't understand God. We can't know the essence, but we can still come to understand God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point, right? The Analogia, according to Nyssa, Maximus, Basil, Gregory Nazianzus, Dionysius, and St. Maximus, is to the energies. And even the logi are uncreated energies, according to St. Maximus. That's why St. Maximus says God's works are infinite. His energies are infinite. And there are many works that we will never even know or understand, because God doesn't even have to bring all of his energies into actuality. If you don't believe that, then creation was a determined necessity. And that's why we don't do dialectics. That's what's so key here, is at every point. Think about immanence and transcendence. Is God immanent, or is he transcendent? Many world religions fall down on one side of this extreme. Oh, he's just immanent. That's pantheism. Oh, he's just transcendent. Oh, that's deism / Islam. What does Orthodoxy say? God is both immanent and transcendent, and he transcends immanence and transcendence. You see. Both and he transcends it, right? He's immanent in that his energies are immanently present throughout the entire world. He's immanently present through his logi of created things. And when he becomes incarnate, he's immanently present in his incarnation, right? So you see, the incarnation transcends that goofy dialectic that many world religions don't transcend. They fall into that dialectic. And when you study the pantheistic Far Eastern religions, the dualistic Far Eastern religions, it's all dialectics. That's what I'm trying to stress to you here. They're all predicated on either or dialectics. Western philosophy is all predicated on either or dialectics, from the pre-Socratics to Plato to Aristotle to the Middle Platonists to the Neoplatonists, all of the Hellenic stuff, even the Stoics. It's either ors. Everything must be this. Everything is water. Everything is fire. Anything that's not is non-being. Anything that's not is, moving away from existence. Anything that's is either this or that. That's not what we do. At every point in our theology, even to the point of Christology, right? When St. Maximus debates Pyrrhus, Pyrrhus says there's some natural tension between the will of God and the will of man. Maximus says, no, there's not, because God created human nature. So there's no natural tension. Any kind of tension is a result of the fall, and therefore unnatural.
Yeah,
it's something you see.
Go ahead. You haven't said anything. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's something you see in every religion that's predicated on a philosophical system, and actually, to an extent, it's also moving away from God. So if you see, for example, the Thomistic categories, or the Islamic playing with number, or how can God be 1 and 3 at the same time? This is ultimately a study not of God as a transcendental being,
right,
but of the human understanding of God.
Yes,
and
form of idolatry.
Yeah. So, for example, when you will have all these mental categories in Thomas Aquinas, you're no longer studying God. You're studying the human mind. When you
right.
have this mathematical understanding of how can God can be 1 and 3, you are studying your own mind, and ultimately you are subjecting God to not your understanding of God, but your understanding of the human mind. And that's also the start of humanism.
Yes,
that's also
great point.
Because if you're already studying the human mind, and that's what you're about, you can remove God from the equation. So
this is why in the triad. I'm sorry, go ahead. I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, sure. I wanted to go on the triad, and that's what also Saint Gregory of Nazianzus tells us to be wary about. Like, you cannot explore things with your own mind like this. He compares, starting to go about relation inside the Godhead, going inside as the essence, as looking into the sun. Like you're gonna go blind, you're gonna go mad, and this is what started humanism. And this is what started just the study of the human for the human, and that's what has been plaguing, for example, the Roman Church today. And we talked last time about the Eucharist and the way that we do not try to define the Eucharist we see it as transcendent. We don't try to find natural explanations to it. We don't need to know exactly when it happens. And the scholastics, in trying to see exactly when it happens, they're creating new heresies. The fact that the Eucharist can be created outside of the worship. It can be created by a priest during dinner, technically. Or they will try to look into naturalistic understanding of the Eucharist. They will make false doctors come in and say, "Oh, you see, we did a blood test on the wafer, and it was done." Or the wafer is we did it's a cardiac muscle and stuff like this. this is just rejecting the transcendental. And it's already a form of atheism, of humanism, because you are trying to understand miracles with your mind. And by definition, you can't.
But let's be clear here, because accepting a miracle is not the same thing as being irrational. Okay, so accepting a miracle is being the most rational, right? Because from the vantage point of Scripture, revealed theology, it actually says that that when Abraham believed God, he did so with full assurance. It doesn't say he jumped into the irrational and had no knowledge of it. So something that transcends nature, that transcends reason, is not thereby irrational or stupid or contradictory. It's simply supra-rational. It transcends rationality. And obviously that's true of God. God transcends rationality, but that doesn't make God irrational or insane, or we're not Photius. None of the church fathers are Photius. That's why you can see in the triads, he moves from saying at the beginning that the Hellenism and the philosophy of Hellenism and Plato, he says, is demonic. He says it comes from demons. And then he can turn around and utilize words or concepts or notions that do have a connection to Hellenism, and they're given new meanings, they're redefined, they're transformed in the Orthodox teaching. And at the same time, he can use logic and reason to talk about and distinguish the absolute divine simplicity doctrine from our doctrine, how the energies are distinct. We're using words, we're using concepts, we're using reason, but we're not identifying or isomorphically equating the reasoning that we do with God. And that's what's so key here. What's in our mind is not identical to what God is or who God is, right? But we do actually and can participate in the love of God, the life of God, the truth of God. All those different names, those energies, those attributes are communicated to us in the process of theosis. So it is a direct perception. It's not a direct perception that's not involving created things. It is, right? Or else we wouldn't have sacraments. We wouldn't have the Eucharist, water and baptism. We wouldn't have relics, icons, all these things that we do have, right? There is grace connected to matter, but the grace that's connected to matter is not in a dialectical tension. It's not like, oh, I either go to the created things or I reject everything created for the uncreated, right? That would be another dialectical problem. No, in the eschaton, there will be a union of the created and the uncreated that does not destroy or remove the natural properties of created things. And this is another problem that people have when they hear about theosis. They think that it means that we teach that, like, you lose being created and you no longer have your human nature or something like that. That would be a heresy, right? Remember the incarnation. When Christ became incarnate and he deified his humanity never loses the properties that it has that are proper to that nature. Okay, so it never becomes the essence of God. It doesn't lose its solidity or something like that, right? When Jesus is resurrected, it's the same body because he's got the wound in the side, right? He could have, if he wanted to, I suppose, transformed his humanity into some, being of light that nobody could touch or see, but no, he didn't do that. He kept the same body that he had and resurrected in that body. And that alone disproves the beatific vision, which has no place for the body. The beatific vision is an Origenist doctrine, a Platonic doctrine of the intellect being satiated by the essence of God. But when Maximus, in Ambiguum 34, comments on St. Gregory of Nazianzus' discussion of the energies, he says that the things that pertain to God's essence, that is, from the essence itself, has never been known. We have no idea what God's essence is. It will be completely beyond the reach of all creation, whether visible or invisible. And that's true at all times. We're never going to penetrate into the essence of God. That's crazy talk. Moreover, from the, quote, things that are around the essence of God, we learn only that God exists, right? He's talking about the energies. The energies teach us that God exists. The energies teach us these things and these truths about God. The energies, the things around God, don't teach us the essence of God. And that's why you can't believe in apophatic theology and Thomism and agree with Maximus here.
Right. Can I point out that when you're talking about theosis, what people are really envisioning is henosis of Neoplatonism, of a subsuming of everything back into the one, when theosis is still hypostatic. We still have a personhood.
Yeah, we won't lose our individual existence. That would be ridiculous in the eschaton. We don't cease being who we are. There's a balance of the one and the many in the church, in the eschaton, and in God.
And so I think, a common Neoplatonic objection will from the monad, they'll say, well, how does God move from a monad, a single, united essence, to a triad? And again, this is fallacious, because what's moving is the energies. The essence of God doesn't move.
Right.
The essence of God is triune. It's a triune. It's a trinity. It comes from the personhood of the Father, but it's the energies that move, and it's these movements, it's these energies, these operations, these logoi, in which we know everything.
That's
or
true.
what we can know, at least.
Exactly. To just one point on that is that sometimes the fathers, St. Athanasius does speak of, or others as well, of the Father being the sole font and cause of the hypostasis of the Son and the Spirit as well. So there is at times language that speaks of a movement or action in terms of the generation and the procession. But the difference is that we're not applying the created categories of movement and cause that are temporal or chronological in the created realm. We're not applying that directly to God, right? The Father is not temporally prior to the Son, right? He is, in a sense, prior to the Son in terms of the origin of the Godhead, because he alone is the cause. So we are saying the Father is the eternal cause of the Son. But that, for us, does not mean that the Son, therefore, has a lesser status of being, or is a lesser status of existence, or he's some lesser cause, or something like that. It doesn't mean that at all. That's why Athanasius is at pains to constantly argue against the Arians and the semi-Arians that a distinction in God, or the Son being caused by the Father, does not necessitate or imply a lesser status of being, or power, or sovereignty, or omnipotence, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He shares all the same attributes that the Father does, except for the hypostatic role of the Father, which is to be the cause. He does not share that hypostatic property, because that's unique to the Father. That's the only unique mark and characteristic that we were revealed about the Father. He's the source, fount, arche, anarche, right? The uncaused cause within the Godhead. So that's how we identify his hypostasis, his personhood. Therefore, the Son could never take on a causal role within God. That's why there's no Filioque, because to do so would be to blend the Father's unique hypostatic property with the Son, to make a Father-Son cause in the Godhead, right? And that's what Florence says. That's why we can't accept Florence. So we have to be very, very precise in our language, and that's why there's no Filioque in the Eastern Fathers. And when the Roman Catholics go and they try to quote mine, they'll just quote mine stuff that relates to the economy. Nobody denies that Jesus sends the Spirit into time and space, but we don't read economy back into the triad, right? We don't say that because of economia, that therefore at the level of hypostatic origins, the Father, the Son takes on the personal property of the Father. And if you read St. Photios' Mystagogy, he makes this point over and over and over.
Yeah, and if I could say one more thing about, I think, for Maximus, the beyond Platonic goodness of God reveals the unity that totally transcends creation, yet while in creation itself, God transcends being and reveals himself transcending being while being incarnate. And so theologically we have personhood, what we're talking about, but then historically we have personhood. It always begins with personhood. And I wrote something down earlier for the talk about the transcending of dialectics.
Hold on 1 second. Oh. So now we got another fussing from Emil again. He likes to come and fuss in the middle of our chats.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Just let me deal with this, because it will have a big fit if we don't deal with this. So what I'm telling you is the consistent teaching of each of these fathers about how we distinguish the persons. Okay. So I don't know if you're debating with somebody in the chat or if you're debating with me, Emil, but you're saying you don't buy this. You're saying even if the Son was uncaused, he could still be distinguished by the incarnation. Well, the incarnation is what reveals the rest of God to us, right? So the Godhead is revealed to us in terms of what we know via the incarnation. So I assure you that if you read St. Gregory Palamas and you read Apophatic on the Council of Blachernae, what you will learn is that we speak of God in three levels, so to speak. You could talk about three levels. First level is the level of hypostatic origin, okay? So this is the only way in which we distinguish the persons. The Father is known as the sole cause of the Godhead. That's his hypostatic property that's unique to him. This is in the intra-Trinitarian relationship from all eternity. It's what's called the ontological Trinity or theology proper. And I assure you, I know what I'm talking about. The way that we distinguish the Son is through eternal generation. The Son is eternally generated from the Father, and that's his unique property, to be the Son of the Father. So when I mentioned Athanasius a minute ago, Athanasius is very clear that the action of that movement is not an energy. It's not a generation by will. It's a generation that's proper to the Father's nature. So the Father has a Son that springs directly from his nature, you could say. It's not impersonalism or it's not essentialism because it's from the Father's nature. It's inhypostatized, you see. That movement is inhypostatized. It's inhypostatic, meaning it's personal. So the movement of the Father, the Son, right? And then the Father also eternally spirates a spirit. That eternal spiration is not completely divorced from the Son. That's a mistake that Roman Catholics say about us. The Council of Blachernae met and dealt with that, right? There is a connection between the spiration of the Son, the spiration of the Spirit and the generation of the Son, but the Son does not participate in the Father's role of being cause. Okay? So this movement, and we can call it a movement of personal relations and personal hypostatic origins, is the first place that we start our triadic theology in Orthodoxy. And I assure you, I'm correct on this. The next level that we could speak of is what's called energetic manifestation. This is where we talk about God's actions and energies and attributes that pertain to him from all eternity. And not just from all eternity, that same energetic manifestation will also apply to history as well. Okay? So for example, the love of God, that's not something that's unique to creation. It's not something that has a point in time. The Father, the Son, and Spirit experience and share a communal love from all eternity. The movement of the love of God is from the Father through the Son and in the Spirit, even within the Trinity. And you can apply the triadic analogy, the psychological analogy that Augustine is so famous for. You can apply that in Orthodox theology at the level of energetic manifestation. And so at that level of the Trinity, as we speak, you can say that there is a special relationship between the Father and the Son, and that the Holy Spirit manifests that as love. That's true, and that's in the 150 chapters. St. Gregory of Palamas' refutation of the Filioque in that work. He there explains that when Augustine, or when the Latins, he's being charitable. He says that we can say this if we want to do it in a correct way. That only applies at the level of energetic manifestation. He says the Latins confuse this with hypostatic origin, and they think that the relationship of the Father and the Son as love is also something that relates to hypostatic origin, personal origins. And it does not. He's very clear about that. And he talks about this. And many Orthodox theologians talk about this, right? Now, so the reason that we have to have this level of energetic manifestation as part of our theology is not just to distinguish hypostatic origins from energetic manifestation of a kind of filioque at this level of the Son manifesting the Spirit, or the Spirit resting in the Son from all eternity, the Spirit shining forth from the Son from all eternity. That's not hypostatic origin. It's only in the sense of energies manifesting in that movement from the Father through the Son and in the Spirit. Again, this is what the Council of Blachernae says. Blachernae is authoritative and normative for Orthodox people. The other reason, again, is that I know, I'm sorry I'm hogging this, but I want to make this very clear for Emil. So another reason we say this, according to Athanasius, who is really the beginning of this, you need to read the essay by Florovsky on Athanasius and creation. I'm constantly telling people to read this essay. Please read this essay. Like, I'm so tired of recommending it. I recommend it like every week because it really solidifies this issue. It shows that Athanasius does not teach absolute divine simplicity. Florovsky definitively proves this because he shows that it's absolutely necessary to distinguish the action of generating in the Godhead and the action of creating, which is external to the Godhead. Okay? And if you believe in absolute divine simplicity, or if you don't make a distinction between these two types of actions in God, a natural generative action that's proper to the Father, and a action of creating the world that's proper to the whole Trinity, then that leads you to Arianism. It leads you to some heresy or absolute divine simplicity or pantheism or deism. Okay, so we have to distinguish energies or actions that are proper to God from all eternity, such as love, and other energies that are proper to God only in relation to creation. This is why when I was debating Paul Williams, I asked him if he thought God was eternally a creator, and he said yes. No, he's not. Okay? So not all of these names... Yeah, that's Islam, right? So not all of these names apply to God eternally. But if you believe in absolute divine simplicity, they do have to apply to God from all eternity. God is eternally a creator. God is eternally foreknowing. Well, if he's eternally foreknowing, what's he foreknowing? A creation? Yes. Then creation is eternal. What about providence? Is God eternally providential? Yes. If so, then he's eternally providential of an eternal creation. That's ridiculous. So Athanasius makes this argument against the Arians. He says, no, not all of the names apply to God from all eternity. Some of those energies are only in relation to creation. Providence, right? Creator, those are names and actions that only apply to creation. They're not true about God from all eternity. That's why we believe that God freely chose to create the world. He wasn't bound. The world's not eternal creation. It comes into being ex nihilo. So ex nihilo creation necessitates the essence energy distinction, because you can only say what I'm saying if you believe in the essence energy distinction. Some of these energies are not proper to God from all eternity. Are they still uncreated? Yes. And that blows the minds of some Catholics, but I could show you where Palamas talks about this, where he reasons this from Dionysius, by the way. It's obvious. It's what we have to say. It's Athanasius who makes this argument against the Arians. Why can't you guys grasp this, Thomists? Can't you see this? Like, you're making Arian arguments to try to mesh them with Christianity. It doesn't work. So, Emil, to answer you, so you have that level of the Trinity, which is energetic manifestation, which has two distinct aspects to it. It's part of the inter-Trinitarian life that's revealed to us. It's not the essence of God that's revealed to us. It's the relationship of the inter-Trinitarian life that a whole synod met to confirm a Blackernay, and then in succession, all the Palamite synods confirm this, right? This point that I'm making about energetic manifestation, that it's not the same thing as hypostatic origins, right? That's the first level of the Trinity. Second level of the Trinity deals with the energetic procession. The third level that we're speaking of here, and we're not saying that God is divided into literal levels, we're just speaking this way. The third level that we want to speak of is the economic Godhead, or the Trinity in relationship to the created order. Right. So in this sense, there is Filioque. Christ does send the Spirit into time and space. Absolutely, nobody denies that. Right. And the low level, like Roman Catholic argument against us, they just go and they appeal to texts that everybody believes. Well, Jesus breathes the Spirit, therefore he's the eternal origin of the Spirit. No, he's not. You can't read economic relations into the Godhead. It will lead you into stupid heresies. Of course not. So there's these three levels that you have to understand, and they are in all the fathers that I teach, that I'm telling you about, and they're in the Synod of Blackernay. I'm telling you, there's a whole chapter on this. Let me get the book. Crisis in Byzantium. Crisis in Byzantium includes entire chapters that deal with our church confirming the Synod of Blackernay, confirming the Palamite teaching, confirming energetic manifestation, and how it's not the same thing as Filioque, and it's not the same thing as Roman Catholicism, and you can't smush these different layers and levels into one. And that's why they rejected the Synod of Lyons. Okay, Lyons is one of the first Roman Catholic synods that confirms Filioque in the erroneous sense, right? Not just in a generic sense. Well, what do they mean from the Son, right? That's what St. Maximus asks in his day. He says, what do they mean? Do they mean it in an economic sense? Okay, so there's a development in this debate up into 1274 at Lyons where they are more clear about it. And they say, no, it's not just economic. It's an eternal hypostatic origin that's a father-son cause, right? The Father and the Son together are a single principle, as Florence later says, of the origin of the person of the Spirit. That's why we can't join with Roman Catholicism. So all the Orthodox people who fuss at me, who don't know what they're talking about, when I start talking about energetic manifestation, please read Crisis in Byzantium and go learn about energetic procession, because I know what I'm talking about. Anyway, sorry guys, go ahead.
So ultimately, there is only two ways for the Roman Catholic to justify the Filioque, and each of these ways is predicated on eroding distinctions.
Yes.
So the first one would be to say that the act of preceding the Spirit is essential. It is a quality of the essence.
Right.
And in that sense, they will say they will have to either go into semi-Macedonianism. They will have to doubly subordinate the Spirit by saying that the Spirit is just an energy. It's just a bond of love that is between the Father and the Son. Or they will go the full way and understand that yes, the Spirit is also coessential,
right.
and therefore the
Spirit precedes himself, right? He's the source. He's his own source, which is retarded. That's what
the Spirit is the source. The Spirit generates the Son. The Spirit precedes himself. So right now, your Trinity is a black hole. There's no more differences. There's no more distinctions inside of the Trinity, and that's why Saint John of Damascus is adamant about saying what we know of the Trinity is that there is true distinction inside it. So they are eroding these distinctions. So that's one way they can go about it, but it's completely nonsensical, because the Father is no longer the source. All the hypostasis as a source. The Son is everybody can generate or precede itself.
right.
There's no more Trinity, and it's modalism. It's one Godhead that is expressed in different way, but there are no real distinctions between them. That's an error that Aquinas also makes. And the other way they have is to erode the distinction between economic and energetic procession,
right.
And ontology. And by the way, we agree that there is this procession through the Son, not from the Son, but through the Son, at the economic and energetic level. Mm-hmm. But the Creed is talking about ontology. So it has nothing to do in the Creed in the first place. So they will erode this distinction and say that, here you can see that Christ says that he will send the Spirit. It proceeds from the Father. Christ will send the Spirit. And they will say that any act in the economy or the energy is forced to be a reflection of the ontology. And in doing so, they're opening themselves to other criticism. For example, when I think it's Matthew 1:18, when the Spirit falls into the Theotokos, does it mean that the Spirit generates the Son? Because then probably the Spirit is bringing the Son.
If you read all of the economic statements in Scripture back into the Godhead, which is what they do at times to try to prove the Filioque, it would lead to the most absurd nonsense.
Yeah. So it will mean that if there's a pure reflection of the economy into the ontology, then the spirits will be preceding the Son. So there will be an inter-procession generation between the Spirit and the Son. It's nonsensical, and the Trinity collapses again. Right. So you are destroying the Trinity with the Filioque. And you are destroying many attributes that are very important. Today, most Roman Catholics in France, they're getting attacked by Muslims. They cannot even answer because they believe the Son is the source of the Spirit. So they don't believe in the monarchy of the Father. Exactly. And they're getting smashed by pure ADS who teach so-called pure monotheism because of this. Yes. So you are destroying the Trinity. And that's why, as a Roman Catholic, I could never understand the Trinity. It is nonsensical until you see, for example, St. John of Damascus exposition. It's perfect. It started with the Father, and then you have the distinction in the economy. So you cannot read ontology in every interaction between the hypostases in the Bible.
Yes, these are arguments.
Nonsensical. you will have new links made everywhere in the relations inside the essence. And Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, I don't know if you have it. Somewhere, but I think Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, when people were talking about the relation inside the Trinity, he said that you don't go this, you're gonna get mad. You go look into the sun; it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And Thomas, and they got mad.
That's a great point. Yeah, I do have that. I have, and by the way, it's not a contradiction to say that we cannot peer into the eternal relations of the Godhead to saying, well, Blackernay talks about the eternal inter-Trinitarian relationships. Right. It's elucidating what is defined and revealed in Scripture about those relationships. It's not peering into them with speculations about relations of opposition or speculations about reading economic relations back into the eternal origins. That we do not do that. That's the point here, is that we have a very precise, very consistent, very clear teaching on the triad from the time of Dionysius all the way up through all of these fathers into Blackernay, right? Blackernay is our response to Lyons and by extension Florence, right, and Florence's statements. So I want to stress too, though, that in the process of this elucidation on our side, as Sneck was mentioning, that process, you cannot forget the great work of St. Photius, the Mystagogy, because all these arguments that I've been making and that Sneck was making, they're in the Mystagogy. St. Photius makes all those same arguments, and he says that when you do this, you're going to create a weird hybrid thing in the Trinity, a weird dyad, a weird imbalance and subordination of the Spirit in the triad. And what will happen is that this will lead you down a perilous course. That's exactly what happened in the West, right? So it's not just St. Gregory Palamas that predicted that the West would go into atheism. If you read the Mystagogy, I read it twice. I highly recommend everybody read the Mystagogy because it's not that long, and all of these arguments,
it's short, it's very precise,
are very precise. They're very clear, and they hold up. Now, it's true that in the Roman Catholic world, after Vatican II, you have ecumenism, and you have I guess we got some things wrong in the Middle Ages. It's time to be more fair. I guess Photius is a good guy, but let's make a point here about Photius, Saint Photius. Let's point this out. We need to, because it's illustrative. I don't know. Somebody put this comment up today. I'm not sure who said it, but Saint Photius is commemorated by the Melkite Greek Catholic churches on February 6th. From the Melkite Sophia Press, the Vesper, speaking of Rome's treatment of Photius in a negative light, reads, "By a lawless decree, a holy one, you are torn from your faithful flock and suffered grievously for the faith." This is the Melkites talking about St. Photius when Rome excommunicated him, said he was a heretic. "O most radiant and most glorious blessed Photius, of great renown, firm foundation of the church, steadfast pillar of piety, hence we honor you with all zeal, O initiate and teacher, O wise doctor of orthodoxy, and far famed herald of grace and truth." By the way, I teach all the same stuff St. Photius said. So does that mean that the Roman Catholic Church now acknowledges me as a doctor of the church? Because if I say all the same things...
We found this today, so
okay.
That's something that's funny, because Rome excommunicated Photius, and the Melkites are celebrating him. And I think even up to the Crimean War, when the Roman Catholic were pushing France to ally with the Turks against the Russian, you had people who said that this is a real crusade, and all the crusades were here to fight against Photius. So that's up until the 1800s. And I got the full version, even if you're interested.
Wow.
But it says that Photius is a confessor, so it was mistreated because he fought against a heresy. Yeah. What heresy did Photius fight against?
the one that Rome dogmatized and has for centuries.
Yeah, like in the Troparians, it says that being of the same mind of the apostles and a teacher of the whole world of Photius, intercede with the master of all, that he may grant peace to the world and mercy to our souls. And the last part is a special damning. With garlands of chant, let us now crown that far shining star of the Church of God, that God-given guide of all the Orthodox, the divinely sounding harp of the Spirit, and the steadfast adversary of all heresy.
Did you hear that, Traz? Traz, did you hear that? That just destroyed everything you believe right there.
Yeah. So you anathemize him, and they are singing as a fighter against a heresy. You are in full communion with people that say that your heretics are saints, and the Pope is fine with this, and it's been going like this for a while. You can find papal bulls that say that we should not Latinize the unions, we should not do anything about this way before Vatican II, and they kept many other saints.
If you're an unclear trad about what we're talking about here, uniates refute your whole system. That's the point we're making here. If you don't understand what we're saying. So I'm sorry. I feel like, Patrick, we're not trying to leave you out or ignore you. I know I've been rambling and I cut you off, and that was because somebody's trying to sort of take over the chat. Emil, I wish if you have questions like that, like bring it to the Discord, and don't try to take the entire like Discord chat into really like difficult issues of triadology. Let's go.
Mystagogy.
Go ahead.
Mystagogy is fine.
Say what?
Yes, just read the Mystagogy. The Mystagogy explain all this way more clearly than we can. One last word about Saint Photios. A lot of Roman Catholic criticism at Saint Photios is that he was promoted to the chair of patriarch very fast without being a priest for quite a while, and they say that this is irregular, this is damning, and in doing so, they totally forget that many other patriarchs or bishops have been propelled towards the throne of the bishops, namely Saint Ambrose of Milan, one of the four great Western fathers. Mm-hmm. So there's actually precedence in the rise to the patriarchy
Saint Timothy
of Saint Photios in the West. So if you want to call it Caesaropapism, I guess there's a problem with Caesaropapism starting in the West. I think it's also in the Mystagogy. Or in the letter of Photios saying, defending himself, saying, I was put there, and Photios did some great work.
Absolutely,
he was well knowledgeable.
I mean, he's one of the pillars of Orthodoxy. The Mystagogy is one of the first things that really challenged me as a Thomist. That I couldn't really answer it. That led me to trying to reconcile it with uniate nonsense. But then I realized uniatism is just schizophrenia. All right, Patrick, I'm sorry that I cut you off. I wasn't trying to do that to be rude to you. We go back to?
It's all good, brother.
Can we go back to where you were when you were talking about the movement in God being personal? That we're not doing like philosophical, metaphysical projects. We're going from what's revealed and letting the revelation teach us about God and the triad. We're not relying on Greek philosophers and Hellenism and metaphysical projects. We're relying on revelation, and that's where we have to start. That's where we have to rely on things. So back to what you were saying. I apologize for all that.
No apologies, brother. That was a fascinating conversation. I was learning from you guys. Again, I'm not as versed in a lot of the church history, especially as you and Sneck. So that was a learning point for me too. But what I was just talking about was Maximus, and again, the personhood, and I guess dialectics, and how we can even see the sort of collapse in dialectics. We've been talking, highfalutin theological language, but even from more of a biblical point of view, when you look at Christ walking on water, we see a collapsing of the dialectic between the nature of solid ground and fluid water. And again, in the personhood of God, we see a collapse in dialectics, and the Theotokos being both a mother and a virgin. We see so the collapsing of dialectics for me was what really, as I mentioned earlier, brought me into Orthodoxy, because it was such an intellectual thing for me when I got into it. I was a non-believer, and it was the convincement of the logical coherency. And that's why your apologetics I find so appealing, approaching a sort of transcendental argument for God, and then really tilting the playing field by then changing up the theory of truth you're using, and using a sort of coherency theory of truth. So I was just getting ready to, it's totally non-related to what we were just talking about. So I feel like I'm kind of,
no, that's fine.
Changing up the kind of pace of the conversation here.
No, that's fine. I think that, so in the book that we're doing, It might be the first chapter. I'm not sure where we'll put it, but I have right here in front of me one of Father Deacon Dr. Ananias' chapters, and it's on transcendental arguments in Apophaticism. And in fact, he argues in that essay that really the most consistent apologetic approach, if you believe in apophatic theology, is the transcendental argument, because it is an argument in part that's indirect. It is an argument from the impossibility of the contrary. It's a kind of apophatic move in apologetics. So it's not an argument that says that I can take a created thing and in a univocal sense show that leads to God, right? It's not an argument where I can take a notion of causation or teleology as if that was a brute fact or not part of a web of beliefs or not theory laden, and just start with that as a clear thing and then move up to a generic God. And one easy way to show this, we actually had an interesting debate in the Discord with a Muslim this last week where this came up, and he was actually trying to argue that you could make a sort of causal argument from created things to a first cause. And I said, well, let me just ask you a simple question. Do you think that the idea of existence, let's just take a philosophic term like existence. I said, do you think that if I'm an atheist materialist, does existence have the same sense to me as a creationist? If I believe in creation, existence, I'm speaking of the things in the world that exist here. Do the things in the world that exist, to me, they're fundamentally created beings, right? Because I believe in creation. Mm-hmm. Creation is one of my governing presuppositions in interpreting the world. So being itself in this world is created being. That's super fundamental to me as a creationist. Now, when I'm talking to an atheist materialist, does being or existence in the world, is it the same? No, it's fundamentally not the same as mine, right? Now, in a sense, because his worldview is not true, we can speak and we can reason and we can have conversation. We can make contact, but it's only because the world is not as he conceives it to be. Because he has two things at work in his mind. He has two contradictory systems at work in his worldview. One of those is Christian presuppositions that the world is created, that he can reason because he's a being made in the image of God and so forth, and use logic. The other presuppositional tension that he has is the assumption of total irrationality, materialism, everything being chaos, right, nonsense, right? He's got two things at work in his worldview at once. So he wants the world to be like a Christian world where he can do those things and there's right and wrong and he can reason and have logic. Oh, but also, by the way, there's no reason, there's no logic ultimately, and everything is just like in my mind. It's all, like there's two, they basically transfer God into their own mind and into their own intellect, right? So what the position that God occupies for the Christian, the atheist just sort of smushes it into his own mind, and his mind basically becomes a kind of arbiter of reality. He becomes his own little God, basically. So that idolatry is evident even in apologetic argumentation, and you have to call that out as an apologist. You can't let them slide with this insane level of idolatry on the part of the atheist. Point being is that I can just take a word like existence and show you that there's no common notion of existence between different paradigms, between radically different paradigms, erroneous paradigms. I don't have the same notion of what the world is, existence is, nature is, to a guy who's a complete radical atheist materialist. In terms of the apologetic discussion I'm saying here, right? If I'm talking to somebody who thinks the world is an illusion, do I have the same notion of existence? Of course not. I don't believe the world's an illusion. It's not a simulation. We're not in the Matrix. It's a world created by God. There's actual objects in the world. They're distinct from me, right? We live in a simulation, man, right? That guy is not going to have the same notion or concept as I do. And this is the stupidity of classical argumentation, classical apologetics. It's just this naive assumption that everybody has common concepts from paradigm to paradigm to paradigm because of the fact that we all use common concepts, right? It doesn't follow.
And I think this is why when I've seen you debate atheists and pagans, I don't think they have the conceptual apparatus to even be operating at the paradigmatic level. They don't they can't,
They've never
like a microscope, they can't even zoom out far enough to see where the argument is being formed at.
Exactly. Yes. Most people, you're absolutely right. Most people are not used to questioning things at a paradigm level. So it's kind of a new, and I think that's the biggest challenge of the transcendental argument is not the argument itself. It's not the validity of the argument. It's not, can you win that discussion or debate? The biggest challenge is getting the opponent and the people to grasp the argument that you're making, because people are not used to doing that. You know what I mean? They're not used to thinking at that level and questioning at that level. And that's the big challenge of that apologetic. You're absolutely right.
And the other side of that coin is people just don't care about, the what I like about your apologetic. A lot of people don't even care about having a coherent worldview. One of my professors from my undergraduate, he's a firmly rooted pragmatist in the school of John Dewey. And when I talked about how, he's known my whole journey per se. And when I last spoke to him and told him that I've been becoming very fond of Orthodoxy and all this stuff, he was very shocked. But then when I told him, about the kind of coherency of the worldview and how Logos theology is working, on me in terms of really forcing me to question and justify the things that I presuppose, he's like, well, why do you care about coherency so much? Like, it was all, and I realized, Jesus, so many of these intellectuals, so many of the, people out there, maybe in the spiritual supermarket, what are they? They're not really looking for truth, for coherency, for something that's totally real to grab onto, and that's also a big frustration, in terms of trying to get people to see this. A lot of people just don't care. They don't care about having a coherent worldview.
Yeah, that's a good point. Apathy is a big issue. So you kind of, in my experience, I just kind of move on to the people that are interested. So when I was younger, I used to try to argue with a lot of people who weren't interested or to debate. So don't waste your time on that. Move on to the people who aren't trapped in apathy. But this is a question I want to ask you, and I'm not trying to cause any sort of squabble between anyone, but let's just say that some people in the YouTube sphere constantly will use the word logos. Everybody can probably figure out who I'm talking about. What I would like to know from you is, did you have a point in your journey where there was kind of a question or a challenge that came to you about the idea of logos? Like, is it just a principle of order in the universe? Is it just like a legal category? Is it just a mental notion, a conceptual framework that we use to make sense of things? Is it like an all-pervading force from Star Wars? Or is it perhaps the second person of the Godhead? Was there ever a moment where, and I'm asking because you are Church of Eternal Logos as your handle, was there ever a point where you kind of asked that question?
Absolutely. That was certainly one of the points in the journey from that class I took where I was forced to read all this Eastern Orthodox theology and was really becoming interested in this idea of logos, the kind of relationship to logoi and how we understand all this stuff. But for me, again, a non-believer, more interested in kind of the philosophical approach, thinking it's interesting. I certainly would have been in that category. And even when, the individual you have in mind was really kind of surging in prominence on YouTube, it's appealing because it's partially true. Even though the kind of a-personalism that comes with that description of it, and not being emphatic and rooting that in the second person, the Godhead, it's still the idea of order and language, and all this, and and even though they can't even pronounce logos correctly, claiming they can read Greek, but I certainly was there, and even on my channel, I have some videos of said individual, because, for me on my channel, I'm trying to build bridges I'm not trying to
get you to call out people. I'm not trying to stoke drama. I'm just curious as to whether, and I know you have now, but was there a point where you kind of grasped the importance of why the logos is not just an idea of logic or order, but that you have to recognize that he's the second person of the Godhead? That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. I mean, just read Stoicism.
Yes.
Just look into Neoplatonism. I mean, that if you just want an impersonal logos, Heraclitus has that, Plato has that, Stoicism has that. But if you want to, again, not fall, then you're going to fall victim into dialectics. You're going to fall victim into all these different philosophical problems. And so inevitably, even if you're approaching all this stuff as a non-believer, but searching for something that's true, eventually you're going to come to, well, it is the second person of the Godhead, even at the theological level.
Right.
And then I think once you get there, the Spirit will start to work on you, and then your unbelief will then start to change and morph into something where it's way more than theology. It's a way of life. It just becomes more and more and more than just some intellectual enterprise.
Right. The intellectual aspect of this, the metaphysical system that is here, can be appealing, but I think eventually you're presented with the challenge that it's more than that. And I think Father Deacon Ananias said it really eloquently this week in Discord when he said that Orthodoxy is not a metaphysical project. And that's what contrasts what we do with traditionalism and perennialism and the Sophia Perennis, is that those are metaphysical projects of trying to intellectually and conceptually piece together the structure of reality. It's not necessarily wrong to talk about and piece together the structure of reality. That's a good thing. In fact, the grandiose metaphysics of St. Maximus is doing that. However, that's not essentially and primarily what the project of Orthodox theology is, because we have to understand, even though there is a lot of metaphysics here, there's a lot of terminology here, at root, man's problem is an ethical problem, right? When man sinned in the garden, it wasn't because of a lack of being, a chain of being, right? That's Origen's conception of the fall. Origen's conception of the fall is a rational metaphysical schism of some kind, turning away from the essence of the one to the many things of changing existence, flux. That's Origen's fall. That's not the Garden of Eden. Okay, the Garden of Eden is a moral violation of God's law that leads to metaphysical problems in the world, like destruction and the chaos that's present in the natural world now after the fall. But man's problem, man's fall, is not metaphysical. It's not a chain of being that's the problem of man. Oh, we need to ascend on the chain of being to being some lighter, airier, conceptual thing, and we're stuck down here in matter, and we got to ascend out of that. No, that's not the problem of man. Man's problem is moral, and that leads to the metaphysical problems. Even according to Romans 8, the entire universe is affected because of man's moral mistake, right? The reason we have death and decay is not because we have some metaphysical problem in our being. It's because of a moral flaw of Adam. So, I hope you're okay there. Sneck's got a big storm. I think they're having connection. He's having connection problems because there's a storm where he's at. But so I wrote a few of these words on this. We're bringing back the old board here. As you can see, this illustrates the point I think that I was trying to make with Patrick, and the point that he's making. If you take some, and I did a talk on this, but if you take some of these kind of classic philosophic terms like reason, logos, even something we all think of like love or, quote, Gnostic, the way these terms are used in different systems and paradigms is pretty radically different, okay? Reason to David Hume is just practical conclusions about pragmatic observations of the natural world. Right? Reason is maybe a faculty that you have by chance in Hume, but reason is not some all-pervading thing that rules the universe. If you were to take reason in the system of Hegel, the whole world is at a fundamental base nothing but ideas and reason. It's the most rationalist system ever conceived of. Right. It's an extreme rational. So to David Hume, reason means something totally different than to Hegel. Take the word logos. In the Stoics, it's an impersonal, all-pervading force throughout the universe that speaks of order and reason and logic to some degree. Okay, that's not what John 1 says. Is John appealing to people in that system? Sure. And we can appeal to people who utilize these things. But our system as a whole, our paradigm as a whole, is what gives us the meaning of reason, the meaning of logos, the meaning of love, right? Some people think love is just porne, is just eros. right?
Mm-hmm.
They think love is just physicality or it's just some emotional feeling. That's not what we think of love as. So even love is something very common, is not a univocal notion amongst systems of thought. Gnostic, this is a certain philosopher was going around saying, oh, St. Maximus uses the term, I don't know, he says actus purus or cause, God's the cause, therefore he teaches Thomism, right? Therefore he teaches what we teach. No, that's ridiculous. He does not teach Thomism because it's not word concept fallacy. St. Maximus says, we are the true Gnostics. Oh, he uses the word Gnostic. I guess Maximus is a Gnostic and we're all Gnostics. No, because he doesn't use...
It's just, it's just one step further from saying that, it's John the Baptist, so you need to be a Baptist.
So now we have Landmark Baptist. We should all be Landmark Baptist now because John the Baptist has the term Baptist in his name. That's a great point. That was a great one, Sneck. It's like the greatest word concept fallacy of all time.
Everywhere. You can see it, in the Catholic saying, oh, it's Catholic Church in the Creed. You can see it in the Oriental saying, oh, Cyril says meaphysis, but he also affirms two natures.
Yeah. So as if the word itself is like, it's a brute fact that you just look at that word and when it gives you that meaning, it means the same thing in all systems, right? Yeah, I mean, this is just absurd. And on the face of it, that you can see that what this shows is that all words, all concepts, all meanings, all of these things are theory laden. When we say something's theory laden, we mean that we can only really understand it and conceive of it in the relationship that it has to all the other aspects of our worldview and our belief system. What I think reason is it's unavoidable. It's going to be informed by all the things that I've learned about reason, all the thoughts I've had about reason throughout my whole life. And when I read scripture and the church fathers, I get further informed, right, by what that means within my worldview. And it doesn't mean the same thing that it means to a Hegelian, a Hindu, a whoever. So some people will say, well, at this point, then you can't talk to anybody. How can you even have a dialogue if somebody in their system of thought, it doesn't mean that? Because their system is not true. That's why. Because the Christian system is true, and that's the basis by which we can reason about these things. So they are talking about reason. They are talking about logic. They are talking about love and other ideas like this. But the difference is that they can't make sense of what those things are in their system as a whole. And that's why philosophy is there to look at and investigate paradigms, investigate things at the paradigmatic level. And that's why it's a little confusing at first, but when you get used to it, you start to think that way, and you start to look at reality that way, and you like you said, zoom out, and you can investigate things at that level. So when some atheist guy is like, God's a mean God, and therefore there's no God, right? I'm going to zoom back, and I'm going to say, what do you mean by mean? How do you have a basis to call something mean? And how do you know that's true, right? I'm going to ask him to justify his claims at a metaphysical, ethical, and epistemological level. And I'm going to always do that, right? That's the apologetic approach I'm always doing. Every time you see me debate, that's all I'm doing. It's not rocket science. It's a very consistent approach of just analyzing people's worldviews. And that's a better apologetic than trying to reason with somebody and use the same arguments as a Jehovah's Witness and a Scientologist could use. Why would I do that? Why am I going to use all these dumb arguments and bad arguments that I could, I'm going to team up with a Jehovah's Witness, right? And I'm going to team up with me and the Jehovah's Witness and the Scientologists are all going to sit on this side. And then we'll have like Dawkins and Dennett on the other side. No, forget all that. It's a waste of time.
And so the people who fall victim to the word concept fallacy, again, have an inability to recognize the paradigm. And it's just amazing how often this happens. And then the classical, when you use a sort of evidentialist approach in your apologetics and you work on the classical foundationalist model, you're not challenging the atheist presuppositions, right? Because you guys are playing the same game. So you're never going to get the other person where you think you're going to get them to. You're never going to get there because there's nothing that you can argue that's going to challenge why their worldview as a whole is totally inadequate.
Exactly. And that's a much stronger argument. Why would you not want to use the stronger argument? It's just from a pragmatic standpoint, it doesn't make any sense. oh, let me use like 50 really weak arguments, and maybe if I stack them up, I can get him to maybe admit that there might be something out there like the Great Pumpkin or something. No, well, why are you doing that? It's a waste of time. God's not the Great Pumpkin, by the way.
If you're working in a dialectical framework, though, what's going to cause you to really get outside the paradigm? If you're a Neoplatonist, if you're a Thomist, if you're an atheist, if you're a logical positivist, what's going to get you outside of the paradigm? And that's why I think the Orthodox, and that's what your apologetics is so perfect for Orthodoxy,
right?
Because again, of our collapsing, even at the biblical level, at the scriptural level, at the theological level, it's collapsing these things.
I think so. I think we need to collapse it into the basic starting points, realize that anything that we say or know or think is going to ultimately be judged and determined by our worldview, whether it's sensible, whether it's coherent. And so just like we have an ultimate authority, everybody has an ultimate authority in their worldview. And this is one reason why we can't be classical foundationalists or just sort of naive epistemic, self-evident maxims or properly basic beliefs, is that there aren't any of those things that are properly basic. As soon as we ask you how you can justify belief in something properly basic, and you think that, say, oh, that's very clear, that's very evident, it's self-evident, and then you reason up to a God who is probable. So you've got created things, concepts, forces that are self-evident. They're more certain, they're metaphysically prior, they're epistemically prior, and they're supposed to prove a generic being that is probable. Oh, it's 98% God, that God exists. Or we can have a pretty good, likely sort of supposition that maybe probably a God exists. What a worthless argument. And by the way, It's idolatry to say that self-evident, properly basic maxims are more certain than God. Does Scripture speak that way? The Scriptures,
exactly.
No, it doesn't.
And that's what you see all the time with the evidentialists.
Yes.
It's like, whoa, what's going on here?
Yeah, I was listening to an old the debate between Bahnsen and Sproul, and I was reminded how like throughout that whole debate, Sproul just doesn't really get it, and he's just like, look, he's like Columbo. Every time I think of R.C. Sproul, he's like Columbo. He literally looks like and talks and acts like Columbo, and he's like, so basically, like, there's a God, and we got to kind of reason everybody to this on the basis of natural theology, because what else have we got? And by the way, just saying presupposition is not an argument, because you're assuming that God exists. You haven't proven it yet. And Bahnsen's just like rapid fire attack, like at every point deconstructing that. And everybody does the exact same thing. They misunderstand it when they first hear the argument that, it's not an actual argument. It's just you stating the thing exists. No, it's asking for justification of beliefs and claims at a paradigm level. That's the hard part, because we can all think about analyzing claims or beliefs or justifying claims in like a normative sense of like billiard ball A hits billiard ball B, and that's causation, and can we believe in that? Should we believe in that? Did it really happen? Was there a cause? What is causation? And right, so that's like the normative level of stuff. But then when we take something to a paradigm level, we're asking a much bigger, a more devastating level of questioning. And we're saying, how do you have a basis for metaphysical claims at all? You see, that's a much bigger, grander, more important, more basic, if you want to use the term properly basic. That's a more basic, right? Rather than saying, is there causation, or it was that causation, or we know causation exists, we're asking, how can you have predication, knowledge at all? How can you even make a metaphysical claim at all? And unless you have the Christian paradigm and the Orthodox paradigm, ultimately, you can't really answer that, because all of the metaphysical distinctions, epistemological distinctions, theological foundations that you find in the Orthodox system as a whole are the argument. They are the ground. They are the justification, because it's a coherent system that explains all of the things that we're talking about. And you can say, well, yeah, but just because you explain a thing doesn't mean that it's true. Yes, and that's why we are comparing paradigms. So we're saying that this is the strongest possible argument, right? We're comparing the atheist paradigm versus this paradigm. My paradigm can explain how and give a justification for how there's knowledge, how there's ethics, how there's, you know, all these philosophical things, how there's this, how there's that, how there's regularity in nature, how there's science. Your system can't even make sentences. That's a devastating argument.
Yeah, and that's where Orthodoxy is especially important, because as we said before, it is a holistic system. It has everything.
Right.
So all of it is full and coherent, and you will find this nowhere else. You know?
Right, and that's why too. It might be helpful. I don't want to monopolize the discussion. I mean, I want you guys to say your piece and say whatever you want to talk about. But it does make me think of, like, if we talk about analyzing a worldview. Again, I know if you guys are familiar with this, I'm just kind of rehearsing stuff. But so we're going to look at 3 areas: ethics, metaphysics. Right. I know you guys all know probably what these mean, and epistemology. I'm not going to rehearse everything, but so in those 3 areas. Ethics, metaphysics, epistemology. These are the 3 areas of philosophy, the 3 areas of a worldview. Very easy to know this. Ethics, right and wrong. Sometimes beauty and aesthetics is classed into that. Metaphysics, what exists, what doesn't exist, what's real, what's not real. And epistemology, how do we know things? What do we know? Can we justify our beliefs, right? These 3 areas are a worldview. Everybody has beliefs in this, in these fields. And so all we're doing in our analysis is asking the justification, the bases for each of these areas in people's worldviews. And the other point we want to stress is that each one of these is interrelated and interconnected to and necessitates the other ones. You can't make an ethical statement that doesn't also involve or necessitate or lead to epistemic claims, right? If you say you should do what is good, right? That's what's the good. Well, the good is something metaphysical. You should do it, right, is an ethical. And that you are saying you should do this, you're saying that you know this. That's an epistemic claim. So you see, all of these will be interrelated. Therefore, there's a limited number of places that a person can go. So somebody will say, oh, you can't do this argument because, like, you'd have to refute 1,000,000 different worldviews. Actually, there's not 1,000,000 different worldviews. Did you know that, like, in each one of these basic philosophical systems, there's only a limited number of ways that you could go? Let's take metaphysics. All right, let's take what's real. So I can ask the question about the world. Is the world created or not? Right? There's not a whole lot of options you can do in that one. I mean, it's either created or it's not created. Right? So we can start with a contrary, a dialectic there. This is dialectic in a pedagogical sense, not in a metaphysical sense, right? So is the fundamental nature of reality created or uncreated? And if people say that the world is uncreated, I'm an atheist, the world just is. It's been here for forever. Okay, so the world is, in this case of this example, the world is eternal. It has no origin, no beginning. Okay. And then I asked the guy, ethically, is there right and wrong? We're going to use a typical kind of basic bitch atheist. Well, like whatever society decides is good, man. So ethics are a social construct and they're relative. Yeah, okay. So ethics is relative. It's a social construct. The world is eternal. It's matter, has no beginning. It's just there. It's always been there. That's a metaphysical claim, by the way, which you can't prove from empiricism. But in epistemology, can we know anything for certain? Maybe some things, but ultimately not like absolute certainty. There's no absolute certitude. Okay, so epistemic relativism as well, right? So this, and this is like most people, okay? Most people you interact with have this stupid worldview. And they probably haven't even thought about these things. This is super easy to refute. At every one of these points in this guy's worldview, it's total nonsense. Let's take the most difficult one first, the metaphysical claim that the world has no origin, it just is. Well, if this guy's an atheist, unless he's been reading Plato or something in college, like if he's just a basic bitch Reddit level atheist, then he thinks that he's an empiricist. Like he knows things by just empirical investigation.
Induction.
Exactly, which we call induction, just investigating from point A to principle A to principle B, right? This, then this, if this, then this. Looking at the world and and tabulating the sense data. Is there anything in the sense data of the world that tells you that the world is eternal? Okay, you immediately he's brought in these extreme metaphysical concepts. Eternal? Okay, first of all, what exactly is eternal? Did you look under a microscope and find eternal? Was it there? Right? So empiricism does not give you these high metaphysical concepts like eternality, okay? It doesn't tell you that the world was always here. It can't tell you. You don't know. So really he should have said, I don't know. But you're going to find when you ask people these kinds of questions, they're going to say all kinds of nonsensical, because they just get this stuff from Buffet, what they heard Neil deGrasse Tyson or some professor say, right? They're just rehashing something that they heard some guys. They haven't actually investigated, right? So the world has no origin. Well, how do you know the world has?
The professors are the same thing you're talking about.
They're the exact same way. Yeah, they're no better. Exactly. They're just more like erudite at the propaganda, right? So first of all, he can't say that the world just is and has no origin because he's utilizing metaphysical concepts that he has no basis to believe in as an empiricist. Next, when he says that everything is relative ethically, that is an absolute claim. That's a universal claim, right? All ethics are relative. When you say all, that's a universal, that it brings in a totality of some set of things. Okay, so if all ethics are relative, then you can't know that all ethics are relative, because what's point 3? Everything that we know is relative. And point 3 negates point 1, doesn't it? If everything that we know is relative, then he can't say the world is eternal and has no origin, because he doesn't know that.
Right.
So at a very fundamental level, his most basic starting points in these 3 categories of a worldview, of philosophy, are complete nonsense. It's total absurdity. So if he can't do this, if he can't make sentences, how is he going to do debate against the Christian worldview? He can't. That's the point. This is a strong, super strong argument. It's the strongest level of argument.
Like from the ethical level, even if you were to take a philosophical approach and you don't believe in an absolute ethic or an absolute morality, you only have a couple places you can go. You can go to absolute relativism, or you can go to, somebody like John Stuart Mill, go to a utilitarian approach,
right?
Or you go to pragmatism. And pragmatism is just saying, well, the world's always changing. There is ethics, there is truth, but it's only relative to that point in time, because everything's changing, everything's all flux, and these aren't that much better arguments, but this is the best that intellectualism really can offer.
Yeah, and when we say everything is in flux, that's an absolute metaphysical principle that is a universal claim that you're applying to everything. You can't even say that. Like, what are you talking about? How do you know everything is in flux? That's crazy. Right. And if everything is in flux, is the proposition everything is in flux also in flux? And so therefore it could be no longer in flux and therefore not true?
Right.
I mean, yeah. So the point is just that it's not word games. It's just analyzing statements at a very basic level to see if they comport with one another. That's all we're doing here. So that approach to apologetics is much more biblical. It's much more patristic, I would argue. Did every church father argue in a strictly transcendental argumentation way? No, but they don't have to, because as you watch the church fathers in their movement of their philosophy and their apologetic, they have no problem, as Father Deacon Ananias says, taking this from Aristotle, this from Plato, this from whoever, when it's true and when it works for what we're saying. We have no problem with that. But it doesn't...
Yeah, and we are taking... Yeah, we are taking these words from them. So, where, for example, the Thomists literally copy paste the Arabic understanding of Aristotle, and actually plays into this Arabic Aristotle game, we are taking these words from philosophy and we are nullifying them. We are destroying this philosophy. That's what we've always done, even the Bible with the use of the term logos and stuff like this. It is appropriating also these terms and making them all terms inside our system. We do not take the system.
Yeah, this is what Maximus does. So if you have the 200 chapters on theology, he begins the talk, and this I'm going to make a quick point, by saying that, yes, we do speak of a God who is simple, in that God does not have parts. But he's not just simple, because he's also many, right? So God is not a first principle. And he cites St. Dionysius to say God is not a first principle. God is simple, but we do not reflect on the essence of God, and God is not a first principle. God is not an Aristotelian first cause or substance. However, when we move to the created order, we can speak of God as the first cause. We can speak of God as the sustainer. We can speak of him being the source of all these things in an apophatic way, he says, this is in the first chapter, when we're speaking of the created order. And he says that we only know this in paragraph 1.9 by the logi of the created order. What are the logi? They're the principles of Jesus, the Logos. And so how does Maximus begin his analysis of philosophy? With logi, with Jesus. That's not the Thomist way. Thomas has a whole book, the Summa Contra Gentiles, where he has 300 pages of arguing that there's a generic essence that exists that's the first cause. No reference to Jesus in this whole book. Let me prove to you a generic essence, right? This is, so classical theist, right? You've been talking about St. Maximus, and when you find the words that Maximus uses, and you think that because it's the same words that Aristotle uses, that therefore he's a Thomist. Within the first few pages of this, he speaks of Jesus' logi as his starting point for philosophy. Thomas has a whole volume with nothing to do with Jesus to prove God. How can you prove God who's not the triune God? It's ridiculous.
Yes, the five ways is actually an excellent argument for Islam.
It is the Islamic argument.
Theism,
Exactly, right?
it's even more. It's the five ways for Allah, basically, and it makes more sense in the Islamic worldview because
Right.
you don't have to introduce this later on. You don't have to say, God is absolutely one and is the one principle, and then you have to introduce distinction inside of the hypostasis, and you have to introduce the hypostasis themselves. So, actually, and if you look at what Muslims do, they use the cosmological argument.
Yeah,
So yes, it's actually not the best argument to have Christianity.
Right. And one of the problems in Thomism that was hard to get across to people, is hard to get across to people, and it took me a while to realize this too, is that there's a mistake being made about where you start in argumentation or logic, and mistaking a starting point for metaphysical priority. That's a constant mistake. So they'll say that, well, we have to start somewhere. So we have to start with things like cause, because you can't start with God, because, we're classical foundationalists, and that's the thing you're trying to prove. So we got to start with something we all agree on, and we all agree that there's causes and causation. So let's start there, and we'll work our way up gradually. Let me preview this. But the problem is that you're not proving the God of Exodus 3 when you do that, right? Who does Etienne Gilson say the God of Exodus 3 is? He's super essence, super substance. He says, I am being. No, that's not the Orthodox reading of that text. If you read St. Gregory Palamas, he says, God did not say, I am supreme essence. I am being. God said, I am he. In other words, he's implying I is personal. I am the personal God. I'm not the God of the Greeks that's an impersonal force. I'm not the God of the hills that the pagans worship. I'm not the demon god of Goblin Moloch that you sacrifice your kids to. I am the ultimate personal God, and my existence itself is personal, because existence is an energy of God that he conveys to us, that we know him through. It's an energy he conveys to us, and all the energies are personal. God's existence itself originates in the person of the Father. That's why we start our theology from the person of the Father. Personhood is where we start. So that ordo theology that we talked about is so crucial for all of our theology. Everything flows from the personhood of the Father, all the way down to our sacramentology, all the way down to our ecclesiology, right? And I'm not saying that to the exclusion of the Son and the Spirit, right? Obviously, that's included in that notion. Anyway, but we're not going to do this stack it up approach of trying to prove generic essences and common concepts, and then we're going to move in the Summa Contra Gentiles, Volume 2, to trying to prove that there could be some created order, that we could all exist, that there's a first cause, that agree that there's a first cause for. When the Bible speaks of the first cause, it says it's the living God, Jesus, who created the world. You understand? So for Aquinas, the created world doesn't tell you about Jesus. You can't look at the created world and perceive logi. Right. Aquinas would think that's crazy. What? No, he would say that's a revealed doctrine. Okay, philosophy, natural reason can tell you about causes and principles and remotion and blah, 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 blah. And you have to reason up to these basic principles. Then we'll tack on later virgin birth, Trinity, incarnation, resurrection. But Paul says the created world itself is an icon of Jesus. And that's why I wanted to mention in Ambiguum 33. Ambiguum 33 is great because, and I'm glad that we actually had this mistake, because I thought you wanted to talk about Ambiguum 33 and you wanted to talk about Ambiguum 34. But in 33, he talks about the thickening. And every person who thinks that St. Maximus is compatible with Thomas Aquinas should read Ambiguum 33, because it's only one page. And it's one page where he says that the created world is based on it's a concealing of the logi of Jesus. And when we're progressing in theosis, we look at the created world, we see Jesus. That's why Father Staniloy says that for Orthodox theology, we don't have a strict distinction between what's the content of natural revelation and the content of Scripture. They're both teaching Jesus. In Aquinas, nature's not teaching Jesus. It's that simple.
You know, it's funny that actually tomorrow, because I'm still finishing my doctorate program, but I'm using my undergrad at university to do research because I couldn't handle the Bay Area any longer. But on campus there, I found a group that's called Ratio Christi. They're actually a Christian apologetics group, and I go there just for fun, just to talk, just to talk these ideas. You don't get to really talk about Christian theology a whole lot. Christian apologetics, but they all are basically evangelicals, Protestants, and it's all the evidentialist approach, whether they do the ontological, the kind of moral lawgiver approach, the cosmological argument, all this stuff. And tomorrow I'm actually giving a presentation because I'm so emphatic every time they present. I talk about transcendental presuppositions, all this stuff. So I'm actually doing a presentation for them tomorrow on what the transcendental argument is and showing them a step-by-step how that's used against somebody like an atheist.
Awesome. Yeah, they need to hear that. I was at Southern Seminary this last weekend, and I noticed very little Frame. They had a few books of John Frame, I guess, who's not the best transcendental argument proponent, but I guess he's better than nobody. And it was like all, evidentialist, normie tier stuff, right? And I noticed too, there was no patristics there except for Origen and Augustine. That was the only patristic works I could find in the whole place.
Two Neoplatonists.
Yeah, exactly. Two Neoplatonists, and which is very amenable to Calvinism, by the way. Many of the Calvinists actually were very infatuated with Neoplatonic philosophy. Stephen Charnock, the famous Puritan, he's very open about it. He's like, yeah, Calvinism is basically another version of Neoplatonism. Because the created world is just a determined reflection of the essence of God, right? Thomas says that. So, anyway, we've gone for 2.5 hours. If you have any,
can I say something real quick, Jay?
Say
I'd
whatever
like to
you
get
want.
your feedback on.
Sure.
I was last week in that same group. I was trying to explain the concept of the Nous, because somebody was talking about how they were talking about Mormonism and Eastern Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the same breath because of the idea of theosis. And so this led to me trying to explain the concept of the Nous. And one of the people was trying to argue that Reformed theology has the same concept of Nous as Eastern Orthodoxy.
I will give Bonson credit for when he talks about heart of hearts. I think that he is kind of stumbling on the same idea, and that's the only reason for that is because Calvin was a humanist, and so he wanted to go back to, I don't mean a humanist in the secular humanist sense, I mean like post-Renaissance era humanism, which is like the scholars Thomas More and no, not Thomas More, who was the Erasmus and Calvin. These people were humanists, and they wanted to go back to studying the original texts. And so some of the Protestant reformers, in reaction against Roman Catholicism, they saw some of the problems in natural theology. And so they would critique natural theology, and they noticed that this would also kind of apply to anthropology. So they didn't exactly get the tripartite idea of the Nous exactly, but they kind of understood what Bonson is always calling the heart of hearts. And the easiest way to grasp this is if you look at Romans 1, and that's because they were looking at the Hebrew. So the Hebrew conception of the heart of man is where the Orthodox conception of the Nous comes from, right? So for us, it's not an primarily intellectual faculty, right? It's the deepest aspect of man's being, his heart, wherein the intellect should be submitted to and work in tandem with man's heart, right? So we don't separate these two things to where we deny the heart of man and only talk about man's intellect, right? If you most dualistic views of man's makeup, what comes to dominate in the West, you get basically this identification of man's soul with intellect. So he has a soul / intellect and a body. That's not the Orthodox view. The Orthodox view is that man has a body, and he does have a soul, but that soul has an intellectual aspect, and it also has a nous, the heart, right? So the heart of hearts, man's innermost being, is what we believe from the Hebraic revelation. And so in that sense, it is consistent. And in that sense, they kind of hit upon the idea of what we believe. And that's why if you listen to like Bonson, when he exegetes Romans 1, he's actually correct that when Paul says that man in his heart of hearts knows that he's an idolater, we think that Paul's saying that man deep down in his nous knows God in some sense and knows that his idolatry is wrong because he's made in the image of God. And so the universality of idolatry, right, is correct, is known and is in man's innermost being known to be incorrect, right? So the answer is yes and no. But to say, oh, they believe in the exact same thing as we do, not really, because Calvinist anthropology most of the time is dualistic, like the West, like Thomas, or like Roman Catholicism, because they just sort of accept the Augustinian approach. And unfortunately, Augustine, to my knowledge, does not believe in the nous. He had this sort of duality view. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But wouldn't it be true, though, that the concept of total depravity would exclude that idea even being related to nous?
So even if they did admit it, it wouldn't really matter because the noetic effects of sin and the total depravity view negate all of your claims. And by the way, they'll say, well, yeah, but we believe in the regeneration of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, but the Westminster Confession and the Reformed Confessions all teach that the noetic effects of sin continue after regeneration, right? And that's one of the reasons why they reject papal infallibility, is because they say, how can any man claim to have infallible certitude, because we're all depraved. Even after we're saved and we experience the regenerative effects of the Holy Spirit, the noetic effects of sin due to the severity of the fall continue after regeneration. And so all you ever have to do is ask a Calvinist, like, how do you know the noetic effects of sin aren't constantly screwing up your interpretation of the Bible? They don't have they can't answer that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's all I have. I just wanted to say that to you and get your response. So,
yeah. I'll give Bonson credit for almost having the idea of the nous, and I'll give him credit for correctly critiquing the Roman Catholic view of Romans 1, right? Because when he critiques the Roman Catholic view of Romans 1, he says, where do you see Paul making Aristotle's five-way argument here? 4 causes of Aristotle. Where do you see the 5 ways of Aquinas in Romans 1? That's not what Paul's talking about. Paul's talking about an inner, immediate knowledge of God that is rejected, right? And that's why we have to convert people. So, but that doesn't mean Calvinism is true, because Calvinism teaches total depravity, which is an erroneous anthropology, and they deny the synergy of man and man's the energy of man's nature in conversion and so forth. So, anyway, yeah. But Romans 1 is not presenting the 5 ways. Romans 1 is talking about what we're saying. We got a few super chats. Sneck, anything you wanted to add before we kind of head to the super chats and close this out? Now, by the way, if you want to, I would love for both of you guys to come back. If there's anything that we didn't get to in this talk, we can have, as many future interviews and talks as we want to. Everybody, his channel is linked below. Be sure and subscribe to Church of the Eternal Logos. He's got a ton of great videos. We didn't get to the topics of masculinity and then the practical stuff that you talk about, which we do want to discuss. He's got some great videos on that. I noticed you have an awesome video on fractals and how nature kind of demonstrates the order and design of God. Absolutely, we don't deny that. Right? So we're not against evidences. We're just against evidential approaches. Everything is evidence. So you've got videos on that, and so everybody subscribe to him if you want to see his talks on all that. He's got a great testimony of coming out of the Terence McKenna, all that crazy stuff. And we will take the super chats, and also Sneck, I need to put your. I know you have a YouTube channel, but I forgot what it was before we started this.
It's a YouTube channel of my deacon. I have of my own. Like we had a deal, I refuse to have my channel since I'm still a catechumen technically. So
okay.
I do
you want to do your Twitter? Because you've got can I put your Twitter up?
Mostly in French. I will give it to you. But I mostly do things in French for my catechumen in our efforts to evangelize in France.
Okay,
but,
so
I'll probably.
But you have a based Twitter in English, so let me put there's his Twitter there. I'll add the Twitter to the show description later, but there it is in the chat if you want to follow Sneck on Twitter, because he's got some hilarious takes and some good apologetics. Stuff. All right, so can we take super chats? Are you guys cool with super chat questions?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, sure. Ones that's interesting. So yeah.
And then also, if you guys want to, you can follow me on Twitter too. I'll add my Twitter as well. I'm trying to get to 11,000. I'm almost to 11 on Twitter. So follow your boy. Here's my link. If you don't follow me on Twitter, go ahead there. All right, so we got some super chats. First one is from Robert Taylor, $5. He says, I hope everyone had a blessed feast. Please pray for our struggling trad cat friends. I have many of them, that they will come to the true faith and the true church. Well, the good news is we are seeing a lot of trad cats gradually make their way. So I get messages every day or two from trad cats who are converting to Orthodoxy. So I think that's why they hate me so much. But we don't hate them. We want them to be with us on the same team. So any guys, well, we will definitely continue to pray for the trad cats. Sneck, Patrick, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pipeline. Usually they will try to reapproach tradition, and they will go to the trads that are still in communion, but then they will understand that their view doesn't fit, so they will move up through the pipeline to sedevacantism, and they will say, oh, anything about 1962 is the Antichrist, but right before it's fine, and then they will understand that actually their vision of traditionalism is just a vision of Renaissance tradition, not apostolic tradition, right. And that ultimately things were still bad before 1962. We've shown it, with Uniatism, so. And usually they end up in Orthodoxy, or they go deeper in the rabbit hole, or into more sect-like thing, or they become atheists. So yes, just follow through, continue your idea, and read Poncello is great. He's showing that actually both the SSPX, which is the trads that are in communion, and the Sedevacantists got a point. But when you unify all of them, it's Orthodoxy. That's true. So yeah.
Yeah, Orthodoxy is really the only one that answers the problems of both Novus Ordo and the Seda, SSPX spheres of things. I think that's a great point. So yeah, if you're a trad and you're struggling with these issues, read the Pontrello book, Set of a Conscious Delusion. Joshua Baker, $5. Jay, can you ask the guest if he feels that the Eastern and Oriental religious practitioners were ever rude or ostracizing to him? And was he ever accused of something like cultural appropriation?
For me, I would say no, actually. They were, the Chinese love Westerners that can speak Mandarin, so they go wild after that. They're just impressed people can actually learn it and have the willingness to, and then go there and speak it. In terms of the religion, I would say they were actually happy just somebody was interested, because if you go to East Asia, most of the people that live there, the natives, have no interest in their traditions. I'd say it's a little bit different in Japan, but in China, certainly, they have no interest in that stuff. So if you're a Westerner and you actually are knowledgeable about it and you're interested, I don't think they don't have the same appropriated, political correct categories that we do. They don't really care.
Yeah, that's funny that and people don't realize that.
That was my experience, at least.
People don't realize how racist various Asian groups are against the other Asians.
Right.
I mean, if you know Asians and talk to them, like, they'll all laugh and make jokes about all the other ones. It's hilarious. Anyway, so the whole social justice garbage, that's really an American Western foundation, education funded, created thing. The rest of the world doesn't operate this way. It's just for it's virtue signaling and social engineering. What were you saying, Sneck?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't even compute for them. I think the Chinese have a word to describe this called like a white left. Like, we literally, bringing these ideas. Supposedly the communist one, but they are still they don't understand all these ideas. And even if you go a bit to Russia, I've been more in Eastern Europe, and it doesn't compute with them. It's something that ingrained into us, and that's been so for quite a while now. And the academic system is fully on board with it.
Harry Henderson, Harry and the Hendersons, and he's got a picture of Arnold. Drive! $2. He says, glad I'm not banned. Kill did not Epstein himself. Right. Jeff Stein Effrey ain't killed himself. Thank you for that, Henry. Let's see. Everybody was I met somebody. Oh, it was when I was at that conference the other day, and they were like, what do you call him? What's his name? I was like, Jeff Stein Effrey. They're like, yeah. Because you don't want to say the name and trigger the... Anyway, Vitaly Khmelski, $2. He says, for the world domination. Absolutely. $2 towards world domination. Thank you. Randy Churchill, $20.
The proceeds would be back to the KGB, of course.
Right. It's that $2 just goes directly to Moscow. So haven't you watched The Americans? It's me and Kerry Russell, right? Like, that's our... Jamie's Kerry Russell. I'm the KGB dude. Go watch The Americans. We're Directorate S illegals that are longtime plants here in the U.S. Randy Churchill, he says, the gnomic will produces dialectics, as I understand Orthodoxy. Correct. Is monism and dualism the result of the gnomic will, or are there metaphysical effects from the fall? Monism and dualism are metaphysical errors that humans make, and so the world religions are a manifestation of false philosophy and false idolatry. So monism and dualism are versions of idolatry, so therefore they are manifestations of a misuse of our faculties, our nous, our will. So yes, you could say that. Yeah, I mean, the best book for this is this book, The Dispute with Pyrrhus, because this is the dispute about the gnomic will and whether Christ had a gnomic will or not, which he did not. I will, by the way, soon be covering this book. I know I promised 2 years ago to cover this book, 3 years ago, and I forgot because it got packed up in storage. Well, now I have all my books back, and we will do a talk on this great book because we will discuss dialectics in Christ and how Orthodox Christology also overcomes dialectics. Purist's whole presupposition is dialectics, that the nature of man is just inherently in tension with God. Christ's human will has to just naturally be in a dialectical tension with the divine will. And Maximus says, not true. We don't do the dialectics. And so therefore Christ does not possess a gnomic will. He possesses a fully human will, and he possesses all of the blameless passions that resulted from the fall, but he does not have a fallen human will in the sense of the descendants of Adam. You and I, we possess a gnomic, deliberative, doubting will. Well, Jesus didn't, because he's a divine hypostasis, right? He can't doubt. He never doubted. And that is covered in Athanasium 21. All of Athanasium 21, 5-6 pages, is just dealing with Maximus showing that Christ did not possess a gnomic will, even though he possessed all the blameless passions as a result of him assuming our nature. And he did that willfully, not against his will. He did it willfully because he possessed a divine hypostasis and divine will before he ever became incarnate. So he willed to become incarnate. And it's discussed at length in the disputation with Pyrrhus. The denial of absolute divine simplicity, the denial of a gnomic will, the denial of dialectics, and the proof of the essence energy distinction in terms of Christology is 100% in this book. That book alone could disprove and refute Roman Catholicism. It also refutes Oriental Orthodoxy, by the way. All right, let's move on to the next one. But great question, Randy Churchill, and definitely read the Disputation with Pyrrhus if you haven't, because that's right up your alley. Nicodemus the Pharisee, $5. Can you elaborate on how the Son is the only begotten if the Spirit also proceeds from the Father? Yeah, so this is when the Church Fathers speak of this. Actually, Sneck referenced this in Gregory Nazianzus. He's talking about the hypostatic properties. He says we don't know what it is to be different, the distinction between procession and generation. We don't know, but we do know it exists. But anyone who tries to peer into that and explain that will go crazy and will never know. So we accept that the eternal generation of the Son is unique to him, and that's how he's the Son, and that the spiration of the Spirit is unique to the Spirit, and that's why he's the Spirit. But what exactly the difference is between generation and spiration is, no man knows. And all the Orthodox Fathers are absolutely 100% agreed in saying that exact same thing. I'm not making that up. Nicodemus, the Pharisee, $5. He says, Sneck, wasn't Photios consecrated by an excommunicated bishop to a filled see after Patriarch Ignatius was exiled by the Caesar? That's a good question. Is that true?
Oh, so that's very interesting. So it's in a period when you have a back and forth, and it's in a period of political instability that actually leads into iconoclasm, the iconoclastic crisis in the entire church and world. So yes, so what happened is that the emperor removed the precedent, the previous patriarch, and put Photios into place. And they say, the real patriarch Ignatius was the one, and Photios is a usurper. And actually, you had a first council of Constantinople, so which is called the Fourth Council, or the Ignatian Synod, which is a robber synod, that actually was, I think it was Pope Nicholas I who condemned Photios at the time as a heretic. And that's why it gets really fun. That was the Ignatian Synod in 869. And 10 years later, you have Pope John VIII, who actually agrees with Photios and reinstates Photios in the Synod of 879, the Photian Synod, the one we consider to be, and that is sometimes referred to as the Eighth Ecumenical Council. So it means that the Pope in one synod declared the ideas of Photios heresy, and in another synod declared the ideas, then the other Pope 10 years later, in another synod declared the idea of Saint Photios true, and actually the Filioque to be a heresy. So this is showing contradiction. Also, if you want to go the rabbit hole of this patriarch was not installed properly, both Ignatius and I think Ignatius was part of a previous imperial family. Photios was related to Saint Theresias of Constantinople, who actually stopped iconoclasm, but then you had resurgence of iconoclasm. Photios later on was replaced by another emperor who instated a 19 years old. So it's all over the place at the time. Even John VIII, this pope, was assassinated because there were also factions fighting. If you go read the Liber Pontificalis, the book of the popes, you will see that he was poisoned and then finished off with a hammer. So you see a lot of conflict at that time. And going to this rabbit hole is really bad. And the fact is, if you take it from the Roman Catholic standpoint, the Pope actually said, there was the last council, Pope John VIII said, no, Photios is not heretic. If you say that they are contradicting themselves, then they are infallibly contradicting each other, because one declares Photios to be a heretic, the other is declaring Photios and to be to promote a real dogma. And actually, the Filioque is a heresy. John VIII, Pope John VIII, well, if he was assassinated, probably a saint, also wrote to Photios, and I've got the letter here. He said, "Rest assured regarding this article, the Filioque, which caused much scandal in the churches, that not only do we not speak of it as such, but the ones who had the insolence to do so in the first place, we hold them as transgressors of the word of God and as corrupters of the doctrine of Jesus Christ, the apostle and the father who bestowed unto us as a symbol, the creed. And we assign them with Judas as tearing apart the members of Christ." So, in this context, yes, John VIII was clearly in favor of Photios and against Filioque, and he was fighting influences in the West, the Frankish theory. Many people who say that this letter is forged, which is weird because you can find it very late into Roman Catholic books. For example, it is quoted in Histoire Ecclesiastique of the Jesuit Claude Fleury, and Roman Catholic historian. So up until 1691 as genuine. So it only starts to be called a forgery when the idea of papal infallibility starts to seep in, because it's non-coherent with papal infallibility. Also, if you want to continue complaining about Photios not being instated properly, you can, as I stated before, you can also remove Saint Ambrose of Milan. You can remove Saint Athanasius. You can find some irregularities in almost all of the papal coronations during the Holy Roman Empire and even later. So this is a rabbit hole we don't go into, because it's saying that any interaction between the state and church destroys the church or makes the church illegitimate. So it's ridiculous and nonsensical. Today, I will recommend you read what has become, the Roman Catholic position on the Photian Schism, which is the Photian Schism by Dvornik, who is a Catholic who actually takes the Orthodox position, says that yes, historically we have to take the side of John VIII. And I would add that to the many people who are formatted into saying, oh, the Filioque question is over, there's been ecumenical dialogue. Yes, there was some ecumenical dialogue between the Orthodox and the Catholic. It's far from over. Basically, what we stated is that we believe in a procession from the Father through the Son on an energetic and economic level. And basically they said nice words, saying, oh, but that's kind of like the Filioque, but it's your way of saying the Filioque. And ultimately, I think Lasche has a great article on this. Ultimately, this dialogue did not conclude in favor of Catholicism. They just eroded their own basis to say that we can be included into it. And so they eroded their basis to say we can be included into it, and we did not change our position. So this dialogue concluded in Rome saying the Orthodox position is valid, and the Orthodox saying yes, our position is valid.
Right, and the Vatican clarification on the Filioque, which is I think what you're talking about, it actually specifies that the two views are still in tension on the very point about the statement in Florence that the Father and the Son together are the cause of the hypostasis of the Spirit, and it says something like the Greek view cannot admit this or does not admit. It says like these two views are still in tension. So yeah. So they tried.
So basically, they're giving, and we're saying that we're right. So this is not solved. It still means the Filioque is a heresy. It's only that you want to accept us by eroding your own dogma because you want general Christianity.
Right, and by the way, so everything that I keep saying and arguing, which both the liberal ecumenist Orthodox don't even know about or ignore, it's all in here. So everybody, please go read the dialogue debate between Orthodox and a Barlaymite. It's not $300. You can get it for $20 from SNUY Press. If you go to Amazon, it's $300. Don't go to Amazon. Go to SNUY Press, and you can get the book for $20. And in 100 or in 90 pages, you'll see a repetition of everything that I argue and debate all the time. And that's the answer to the next question, which is how do emotions fit into human ontology, body or soul? Are they related to the animal instinct? Emotions aren't bad. They're not identical to the passions. The passions are the movements that we have, body and soul, that are thrown out of whack after the fall. And so one of the things that comes up in this debate actually between the Barlaymite and the Palamas is that very question, because the Roman Catholics wanted to practice mortification, to which they felt that they could somehow get rid of the body and the aspects of the body somehow. And so you see, as Sneck and I covered in our stream on the Jesuits a while back, these extremes in Roman Catholicism of like extreme denial of the body and trying to flee the body, all the way over to these extreme sort of like flagellants and all this crazy stuff. And St. Gregory Palamas rejects all this. Says, no, we don't mortify the flesh. We bring it into subjection, and then we transfer those emotions and passions towards God. So we don't get rid of emotions. Emotions themselves aren't bad. They're just thrown out of whack after the fall. And so that's an important distinction. And by the way, that Francis Dvorak that Sneck mentioned, I read that book a long time ago, about 10 years ago. By the way, it's really good. The Photian Schism, I recommend it. He is also the author of this super rare out-of-print book, The Origins of Intelligence Services. What? Oh, yes, Father Dvorak also happens to write this gigantic tome about the history of intelligence agencies, which I'm currently reading and which will be next in our analysis of globalism books. Moving on, White Top, $2. Thank you, White Top. Much appreciated. Even if it's $2, we love you. He's always throwing in them deuces. Thank you very much. And then Dick Raw. Thank you, Dick, for that $5. I don't think Dick has any comments. And then we have Justin. Oh, wait. No, wait, he does have his next comment. I can't see all these super chats. There we go. Did Church of the Eternal Logos ever read Christ the Eternal Tao by Hieromonk Damascene? What are your thoughts on it and its way of evangelizing to Eastern Asians? I'm a little late, so I'm sorry if he's already talked about this. No, he hasn't. It's a great question. He hasn't answered this. I don't know if he's read it.
I have read that, and I think it's a great. I think it's a great book. I think Taoism really is the sort of about the furthest you can get from natural revelation in terms of approaching the idea of logos, and I think that it is a great tool to sort of evangelizing to East Asians. So, for example, some of you guys may have read the book The Jesus Sutras by Martin Palmer, and the whole history of the sort of blending of Christian doctrine. Of course, they were all Nestorian, and that was the Oriental Church of the East. But Christianity has always been, well, not always, not since China became communist, but traditionally has been well received in China. In fact, in the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century, when it first entered China from the Silk Road, it was considered the religion of light, and it had a privileged status among the Tang dynasty. And the Christians got their own pagoda there in Xi'an, which was then the capital, and they would fight off the Mongols. And so the Christians basically defended a northern section, a section of the northern border there in China. And so you already see a kind of, a rising of Christianity within mainland China. And I think that this is a great avenue, because we can speak to them just like John the Theologian did for the Stoics, and then, the Middle Platonists when he was writing his gospel, that we can use the language of Taoism, we can use the language of Tao and connect that with the organizing principle of Christ, the Logos. And so I do think it's very hopeful. And I also think that if you guys haven't checked out the Jesus Sutras, they're really interesting.
No, I'm not aware of that. What's the Jesus Sutras? Who's that? What's that?
It's a guy called, his name's Martin Palmer. He's an Anglican, but he's a Chinese scholar, and he found these various sutras after, this was in the 90s, these sutras that were hidden in a pagoda, which was theorized to have been like a Christian church. And nobody actually thought it still existed. He had heard about it when he was in China, I think in the 70s or something, and he returned in the 90s. And he got word that during World War II, there was a Chinese, it was a spy, but he posed as a scholar there doing land surveying of China. And he identified this particular pagoda as originally being Christian. And so he had seen this. So when he went back to China in the mid-90s, he went to try to find this specific pagoda, and he ended up finding it. And then they ended up letting him eventually get inside of it a few years later. And inside was all this Christian art, references to Christ, statues of Jesus, and all this stuff. And inside were these sutras that were blending Taoist thought and Buddhist thought. So, for example, Tibet was Christianity was really growing in Tibet in the 7th century, 8th century, and the Buddhists wanted to take over. So they actually started to kill and force the Christians out of Tibet to convert the Bon people, which is the tribal religion there in Tibet, to Buddhism. So Tibetan Buddhism is a tantric form of Buddhism. Vajrayana is a unique form of Buddhism. It's very tantric. It's magical. This is why, in Indiana Jones, they're going to Tibet, the Nazis, because their backward moving swastika they're getting from Tibetan forms of Buddhism. Right. So the book's really interesting because it talks about this history of Christianity, Oriental Christianity. So again, we're going to disagree with the theology there, but Christianity was like wildfire in China.
Right. Yeah, no, there is a valid way to do comparative religion, and I think that books like that do that accurately. Let's see, Justin HS. Will you ever get Ruchon? I think that's likely. I think we've had a few conversations about theology and worldviews, and I mailed him my books, so he might be interested in that. We'll have to see. Emmett, by the way, so ML had another comment, which is true, yes. So he says the Orthodox Study Bible gives us a hint at the difference between aspiration and being begotten. Seth is begotten from Adam, who's unbegotten, and Eve is from Adam, but not begotten. You could make an analogy, but the problem is that any of the created analogies aren't exactly applicable to ontological Trinity in terms of hypostatic origin, and that's the point there. So maybe in a loose analogical way you could say that, and there are some analogies that can apply, but exactly what the distinction of the words themselves mean, the fathers are pretty consistent that we don't know. But I will say that, yeah, you could also perhaps say something like, well, could we learn something about the distinctions in the persons by the fact that the Son becomes incarnate and the Spirit doesn't and the Father doesn't? Yeah, in a way, but it's a very apophatic kind of thing. Like, we know the Son because the Son comes to us and reveals himself to us, and the Spirit didn't become incarnate and the Father didn't become it. So, but that doesn't tell us a whole lot about the Father or the Spirit, right? Just because they didn't become incarnate and the Son did become incarnate. It tells us about Jesus because Jesus tells us about himself. But I think that if you look at the way the fathers speak of the triadic model of the movement from the Father through the Son and in the Spirit, the way that we are brought into Christ and into the life of the Trinity is the Spirit leads us to Christ, who leads us to the Father. So the Holy Spirit is who works in us to bring us to Christ. Christ is the revelation of the unbegotten Father. He's the icon of the Father. So I think that in a way you could say that helps us to distinguish the persons in terms of the incarnation, but we have to be very careful about not reading economic things, truths about the economy, into the hypostatic origins, because that's a source of many heresies and a constant critique of the Orthodox Fathers against Roman Catholicism. Let's see. I don't see any more. So this has been a great talk. Thank you, Church of the Eternal Logos. Everybody subscribe to him. He's got
Jay, can I say one thing?
Absolutely. You can say whatever you want.
I wanted to recommend you to do something. Not that you should, but just a suggestion.
Sure.
Have you watched The Chosen?
I saw you did a video, but I haven't seen that yet. What is that?
Yes, so there's this app. It's got over like 6 million downloads. It's really like wildfire right now. People, and I found out from my Antiochian parish, one of the deacons told me to download it. But if you, I know you do film analysis and stuff, but they have these episodes. They have 8 episodes the first season. I would be fascinated, and I think it'd be really helpful for a lot of people. It'd definitely be helpful for me if you did Orthodox critiques of those episodes, because they're produced really high quality.
Okay.
But it'd be interesting. For example, one of our brothers, the handle on YouTube is OK, but he highlighted that for me today that the Orthodox understanding was that Mary Magdalene, though she was possessed of the 7 demons, it was not from fornication or prostitution, and I was under the impression it was. But it would be fascinating if you did an Orthodox critique of each episode, and because they're just really well done, and I think people find them really interesting. They're really hot right now amongst Christians.
That's a great idea. I thought the text does say that she had 7 demons.
That's what I believe. She had 7 demons. I was told at the parish that the 7 demons were from fornication. However, our brother sent me an article, and from the Orthodox understanding, that doesn't say how she came about those 7 demons.
Well,
but the show suggests that
she's not a prostitute. I think that's a later conflation, just, in the West, they love to group up, the Jameses, and they did the same with the Marys, and that's where they conflate Mary with the prostitute. But yeah, you should do this. We could like study it as well, or do something. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that. I didn't know what it was. So it's an app that's like a movie? Or
dude, it's basically the quality is like Game of Thrones. That's what you guys got to at least check it out. The video production is incredible,
right? And
what it is it's not following like Jesus around per se, but it's called The Chosen, and what it's trying to do is show how each disciple of Christ, their transformation, what they were before, their encounter with Christ, and then their transformation after, and then throughout each episode, it's depicting biblical narratives. So it's really, really interesting, and I've been sharing it with people because once I saw the first episode, I binge watched it, and so now it's all for free. So whether you're Apple or Android, you just go to your app store, put in The Chosen, you can download it totally for free. It's all 8 episodes, and they're right now raising money for the 2nd season. So they got an okay for the 2nd season, and they're going to do 8 more episodes, and their goal is to do 7 to 8 episodes. Seasons, not episodes. I'm sorry, 7 to 8 seasons. They're raising money for their 2nd season, and so all the Gospels, all the different narratives are going to be compressed in a really high production video to spread around the world, and which in my video I said is good for an illiterate world right now where people don't have enough attention to actually read.
Yeah. I don't. We had a good talk about this in the Discord. Sneck and I did. Sometimes these Jesus movies, I don't know about The Chosen, but they kind of can lean a little Nestorian at times, which is a little dangerous. My inclination is not to necessarily dislike all Jesus movies, but that one, the Gospel of John with Desmond from Lost. I always think
Right.
I think it's not a bad movie. It's pretty well produced, and it's the entire Gospel of John. But sometimes they kind of get into these theological errors where they don't realize they're presenting Nestorian Jesus, like the Jesus who's not sure. I don't know off the top of my head if the Gospel of John one does that. And the most notorious is, of course, the Last Temptation of Christ, which is not biblical at all. It's totally blasphemous, and that's total Nestorian, Arian Jesus, who's like on the cross. He's like, man, should I even be doing this? What the heck am I doing? Why don't I just go live it up? Oh man, that's not our view. Jesus is a divine person, right? So he's not.
Yeah, it's been on substitutional theory, and it's a bit pornographic.
Right.
Well, if you find some time, Jay, I would definitely watch them, because I'd be interested on a strict Orthodox critique of each episode. Because like at my parish, they're all Orthodox, and they love it. Even the deacon, he's the one that told me to download it, and he wants to start using the episodes as teaching tools. So I'd be curious from your perspective what you think of it.
Okay, yeah, we'll take a look at that.
I'll watch it.
Yeah, you too, Sneck, for sure. You guys know, you guys are a little bit beyond me in terms of the biblical stuff. My training's more in like the philosophy, more like analytical stuff. But I would be fascinated what you guys have to say.
All right, we'll take a look at it. All right, follow Sneck on Twitter, and follow Church of the Eternal Logos on his channel, and also I guess on his Twitter too. I'll add his Twitter later. Thank you guys. Would you be willing to come back and chat again?
Oh, of course, man. I had a great time.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sorry if I talked too
Just
much.
need a topic. Yeah, I mean, we've covered 3 hours, but yeah, just need a topic and we can go on for quite a while. Also, if you're French, go to our YouTube, to our Discord, and if you want to debate or discuss Orthodoxy, if you're an inquirer, you can also go to Jay's Discord. Yeah. We're having great discussions there.
All right.
Also, today my website just went public, so if you check out churchoftheeternallogos.com, got a brand new website. And in a few days, once Squarespace gives me my damn domain, that will be the main domain for the website. They'll both go there. But if you guys have time, check it out.
All right. Thank you guys very much. God bless everybody. Have a good night.
All right.